In the small town of Pennsdale, Pennsylvania, the mornings start quietly. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of farmland and metal, a mix of nature and industry that defines much of rural Pennsylvania. Just off Cloverleaf Road, tucked among fields and warehouses, sits Economy Locker Storage Company, a meat processing facility that's been part of the community for decades. Inside, the work is steady and physical. Grinders humming, conveyors running, and knives clattering against the stainless steel. It's not glamorous work, but for the people there, it's honest, dependable, and part of daily life. On the morning of April 22nd, 2019, the plant came to life as it always did. The fluorescent lights flickered on, the smell of raw meat and cleaning solution filled the air, and the low mechanical rumble of grinders and mixers began. Workers moved between machines, their white aprons streaked with red from the morning's processing. These machines are essential. They grind hundreds of pounds of meat each hour, but they also represent one of the most dangerous parts of any food plant. The augers inside them are enormous. The blades hidden within can tear through bone and flesh as easily as through a slab of beef, and every worker in that building knew to respect the machines. Among those employees that day was 35-year-old Jill Greenanger, a longtime worker at the plant. By all accounts, she was experienced, careful, and well-liked, and the Economy Locker facility was her everyday world, a place she knew inside and out. That morning, she went through her usual routine, working near one of the large industrial meat grinders that sat in the back of the plant. The machine was over 4 feet tall, a metal beast built to handle huge batches of ground product. But at around 11:30 a.m., the routine broke. The plant was busy, with the sound of grinders, fans, and compressors filling every corner. Jill was working near one of the machines when, according to investigators later, she climbed part way onto a rolling stair ladder, which is the kind used to reach the top of tall equipment. What she intended to do is still uncertain. Investigators think she may have been checking the grinder's hopper, or maybe just adjusting something inside the chute. No one knows exactly what happened. The moment came and went in silence, drowned out by the constant roar of machinery. But in that brief window, something went terribly wrong. Jill lost her footing, or maybe her clothing may have been caught, but in an instant, her body was pulled into the opening of the industrial grinder, and this machine didn't stop. The rotating augers inside were designed to pull meat downward into spinning blades, and that's exactly what they did. Her body was dragged into the mechanism before she could scream for help. The metal auger gripped and twisted, pulling her deeper with immense force. Her arms went first, crushed and torn as the blades ripped through flesh and bone, and within seconds the rest of her body was consumed by the machine. Now remember, in this plant it was very noisy, so it wasn't until several minutes later that co-workers realized something was wrong. A few noticed her absence, then the unnatural rhythm of the grinder's motor. When someone looked inside the processing area and saw blood splattered around the machine, they screamed for the power to be cut. When the grinder finally stopped, what they found was unspeakable. Jill's body had been drawn completely into the machine. Her remains were mangled and compressed within its steel housing. This scene was gruesome beyond comprehension. Blood and tissue coated the inside of the chute, dripping down onto the floor in slow, thick rivulets. A co-worker who had seen the aftermath later told investigators that they couldn't even recognize what they were even looking at. A supervisor called 911. His voice was shaking as he tried to explain to the dispatcher that someone had fallen into a meat grinder. Now, I know what you may be wondering. If this was a meat processing plant, how did they know the meat inside was Jill's? Well, they also found shredded clothing which matched Jill's clothes. Not only that, there wasn't supposed to be any meat in the machine, as they didn't start processing meat yet at that time. But either way, emergency crews shut down all power and began the grim process of recovering what was left of her. The task took over 2 hours. Workers had to dismantle parts of the grinder piece by piece to retrieve her remains. This was so bad that firefighters described the scene as one of the worst they had ever encountered. There was no doubt about the outcome. She had died instantly. Her body was crushed and shredded by the blades before anyone could reach her. Investigators from OSHA and local law enforcement examined the site. They determined that Jill had likely been working alone at that time, climbing near the machine without another worker nearby to spot her. It's possible she was trying to clear a blockage or inspect something from above. Normally, safety procedures would require machines of that type to be fully shut off and locked out before any maintenance or inspection. But that morning, for reasons no one will ever know, the grinder had still been running. Her co-workers and family were devastated. Jill was remembered as hardworking, kind, and bright, a woman who showed up every day and did her job without any complaints. OSHA opened an investigation almost immediately, reviewing the company's safety protocols and training. Economy Locker Storage Co. was cited and fined later that year for serious safety violations, including failures to properly guard the machinery and to ensure workers followed lockout/tagout procedures before working near active equipment. The penalties totaled $42,000. But no dollar amount could match the magnitude of what had happened in that room. By that afternoon, news trucks were parked along Cloverleaf Road, their cameras pointing toward the nondescriptible warehouse. Reporters tried to make sense of it, but no words could soften what had happened inside. A young woman had been consumed by the very machine she had worked beside for years. The morning of March 26, 2020 began quietly in Byron, Minnesota. The town sits west of Rochester, surrounded by farmland and low furrowing fields that stay pale through late March. That morning was cold and calm, the kind of gray dawn where everything feels half awake. At the edge of the town stood Duke Aerial Equipment, a rental yard filled with towering lifts, scissor booms, and construction gear. The yard was still damp from melted frost, with rows of machines standing silent under a thin haze. Workers there spent mornings inspecting and testing the equipment before it went out for rental. Long metal arms rising and folding in slow mechanical arcs as engines coughed to life one by one. Around 7 a.m., Anthony J. Strayed, 37, clocked in. He worked there as a mechanic for years. Colleagues said he was dependable. That morning, he was assigned to perform a function test on an aerial lift, one of those massive jointed machines used to reach power poles or paint the upper stories of buildings. It was routine work. He had done this countless times before. You start the lift, check its hydraulics, extend the boom, rotate it, and make sure every control responds the way it should. The lift he was testing sat on a patch of gravel near the driveway entrance. The ground there sloped just slightly toward the street, and above that stretch of yard ran a row of overhead power lines. Thick black cables strung between tall wooden poles. They'd always been there, cutting across the property like a silent boundary. Anthony climbed into the lift's small basket and began testing the controls. The machine's diesel engine rattled to life, echoing through the yard. He raised the boom slowly, with the hydraulic arms groaning as the basket lifted higher into the still gray sky. At ground level, other workers moved around, checking tires and tools, the usual early shift hum of the activity. From below, the basket moved smoothly, up, out, and rotating. Nothing unusual, but the higher the boom stretched, the closer it came to the overhead lines. There was no sound, no spark at first, just the mechanical whirling of the lift's joints. The gap between metal and cable narrowed foot by foot. Now, electricity doesn't warn you when it's about to strike. There's no smell, no crack until it's too late. When the lift arm reached just within arc distance of the power line, maybe a foot or two, the current jumped. And in an instant, 12,000 volts surged from the line into the metal boom. Basically, the machine became a live conductor, and the current followed the easiest path to the ground, through Anthony's body. And the shock was catastrophic. It hit him like a silent explosion, locking every muscle in his body at once. His hands seized around the controls, his back arched violently, and his chest muscles contracted so hard it likely tore fibers in his ribs. Witnesses would later say they saw a bright flash, a burst of white-blue light, or the boom met the power lines. For a split second, the air filled with a crackling hiss and the smell of ozone. Then came the smoke. Electrical current superheats everything it touches. The metal burned. The paint on the lift blistered. Sparks rained down into the gravel below. Anthony's clothing caught in small bursts of flame before extinguishing under the heat of the current itself. His skin charred where it made contact with metal. Hands, arms, chest, and internal burns traced through his body like lightning scars. The current passed through his chest, into his abdomen, and out through his feet, exiting wherever it could. Inside him, tissue vaporized along the electrical path, with his heart stopping instantly. But the lift continued to hum, motionless now, but the boom froze in place. From the ground, coworkers shouted his name, but he didn't move. No one could climb up as the machine was still live, and the moment anyone would touch it, the current would flow into them too, One worker tried to approach, but saw sparks still flickering around the contact point and stopped. The line above hissed softly as a faint shimmering vibration in the cold air. Someone naturally called 911. Emergency dispatchers sent the Dodge County Sheriff's Office, the fire department, and the Excel Energy crews to the site. The first responders arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do until the power was cut. So for about 5 to 10 minutes, they stood back, waiting for utility workers to de-energize the line. The lift stayed extended with the basket swaying slightly in the wind, the smell of burnt insulation and scorched metal heavy in the air. When the power finally went down, the yard fell silent. Even the birds seemed to stop. Firefighters moved in, lowering the boom manually, their gloves blackened by soot. They reached the basket and found him there. His body was slumped forward, still strapped by the harness, smoke still rising faintly from his clothes. Paramedics would check for a pulse, but the shock had destroyed his internal organs. The burns were so deep they had cooked muscle down to bone. His skin had turned gray from the contact points, with the air reeking of burned flesh. They would pronounce him dead at the scene. The investigation that followed revealed how easily it could have been prevented. The overhead lines that crossed the property carried over 2,400 volts, enough to kill anyone instantly on contact. Duke Ariel had a policy stating that no lift should ever be operated within 15 feet of energized lines. But that morning, the lift had been parked almost directly beneath them. It was a hazard that had existed for years. The company routinely stored and tested equipment in that same area, sometimes even with booms raised. And the lines were never even rerouted, nor were warning signs or physical barriers installed to remind workers of the danger overhead. Inspectors from Minnesota OSHA arrived later that day. They photographed the lift, the power lines, and the burn marks on the boom. Their report was quite blunt: inadequate safety training, poor hazard assessment, and a failure to maintain proper clearance from power lines. It wasn't even the first time Duke Ariel had been warned about electrical hazards either. They were cited for multiple serious violations, including failure to instruct employees in electrical safety and failure to provide a safe workplace. The company faced fines and was ordered to overhaul its training programs and site layouts. But for Anthony's family, this didn't really matter. His obituary described him as a devoted father, a loyal friend, and someone who could fix anything. He had been working towards saving for his first home. Instead, the morning he went to test a machine turned into the last moments of his life. In the months that followed, Duke Ariel changed its operations. The power lines were de-energized and later rerouted away from the lot. Testing areas were moved and warning signs went up, but it had taken a life to make that happen. Downtown Montreal was still warm. Evening came on June 8th, 2009. People had filled the patios that lined Peel Street, taking advantage of the last stretch of daylight. Cars rolled by in slow bursts of traffic, with music blending faintly from somewhere nearby, and the buildings catching the sun in their windows, turning them gold. At one of the restaurants along that stretch, the Madison, a woman named Leah Gilbert sat outside with her husband, Alex Lemaire. They picked the patio because the air felt good after a hot day, and the light breeze coming off the street kept the air moving. The table was small, tucked close to the sidewalk. Leah had taken off her jacket, and the drinks were already half empty. Above them stood the Marriott Residence Inn, a tall, clean-looking hotel whose entire front was a patchwork of glass panels fitted into silver frames. From below, it looked perfect, sleek, modern, and quiet. Nobody looking up that night would have even thought twice about it. But one of those panels wasn't right. The sealant around its edges had begun to fail, the metal frame pulling loose just slightly from the glass. The defect was invisible from the street. It didn't make a sound, and for years it had been holding together by tension alone. And now, as the evening cooled, the material was contracted in just the wrong way. Down on the patio, Leah and Alex were laughing. The sound of their voices mixed with the scrape of forks, the distant honk of a car, and the hiss of a bus stopping at the light. Everything felt normal. Then came a noise, quick and sharp. A metallic pop from somewhere above. It was over almost immediately after. A pane of glass nearly the size of a door tore free from its frame and dropped. It didn't tumble nor shatter mid-air. It stayed whole, slicing downward like a blade. People nearby heard the rush of air before they saw anything. The glass hit the patio with a sound no one could forget. It exploded on impact, and the force of it slammed directly into Leah. The panel's edge struck her head and shoulder with all the speed of a falling car windshield. It shattered as it struck, breaking into a rain of jagged shards that sprayed across the ground, slicing into legs, hands, and faces. Dishes went flying, with people screaming and ducking under tables. When Alex looked back at his wife, everything around him had changed. Leah was on the ground beside the table, and she wasn't moving. Her body was twisted at an unnatural angle, half covered in glass. Blood spread fast beneath her, soaking the tiles. Her head and chest had taken the full weight of the panel, and the blow had crushed her skull and severed her neck so badly that the wound poured freely down her shoulders. He dropped to the ground trying to lift her, but his hands were slipping in the blood. The glass was everywhere, embedded in her head, sticking out from her arms, crunching under his knees as he knelt beside her. He tried to stop the bleeding, but it just kept coming. People around them were screaming for help, shouting for someone to call 911, crying out in disbelief. A waiter stood frozen, staring at the hole in the sky where the glass had come from. The street fell into chaos. Chairs were overturned, diners stumbled away, bleeding from smaller cuts. A few brave ones tried to help, using napkins to cover the worst wounds, but Leah's were beyond help. Her breathing never returned, and the light in her eyes was already gone. By the time the first ambulances arrived, Alex was still kneeling in the middle of it all. His hands were covered in red, with the knees of his jeans soaked through. Paramedics had to pull him back to get to her. They worked quickly, but when they saw the injuries up close, the crushed skull, the torn arteries, and the damage to her spine, they stopped. Because realistically, there was nothing they could do. The impact had already killed her. Police closed the street within minutes. They looked up and saw the broken panel's frame hanging open, a jagged gap high above the patio. Glass dust shimmered in the air as lights from emergency vehicles hit it. The scene really looked unreal. The blood, the overturned tables, and the people huddling together crying. News spread fast, and within an hour reporters had arrived, and cameras were filming the patio from beyond the yellow tape. They caught the aftermath. The white tablecloth stained dark, the glass glintering under the lights, and the building's dark opening where the window used to be. The next morning the headlines were everywhere. A woman killed by falling glass in downtown Montreal. It really sounded impossible, but when the engineers began inspecting the facade, they realized the danger had been there all along. The adhesives and bolts were deteriorating. Temperature swings had loosened entire panels, so it wasn't one freak flaw. It was a pattern of neglect that could have sent any of those glass sheets crashing down at any time. Leah's death set off a chain reaction. The city ordered emergency inspections on glass facades across downtown. But for Alex, that wasn't enough. He wanted accountability. So he filed a lawsuit against everyone who had designed, built, or maintained the hotel's facade. The architectural firm, and the engineering company, and the general contractor construction. For years, the cases dragged on. Experts reconstructed the building's design, pored over technical drawings, and debated who should have known the risks. When the judgment finally came down in 2016, it was decisive. The court ruled that Leah's death had been caused by professional negligence, a failure in design, inspection, and supervision. It wasn't fate, it was carelessness. The companies were held financially responsible, and the total damages came to nearly 5 million Canadian dollars. Most of it, just over 4 million, went to Alex Lemaire for the trauma, lost income, and the unbearable reality of what he had witnessed. The remainder went to Leah's family for their suffering. The engineering firm bore most of the blame, but the others shared the rest. The companies appealed, but 3 years later, the Quebec Court of Appeal upheld the verdict, leaving the judgment intact. By then, Montreal had already rewritten its safety codes. News laws required every high-rise owner to have their facades inspected by certified engineers every 5 years. Teams began descending down towers all over the city and documenting even the smallest cracks or loose bolts. It had been raining in Fife since morning, that thin, endless kind of drizzle that never becomes a storm but never stops either. The sky was a flat gray slab pressing down on everything, and the streets gleamed under the orange hum of the street lights. Cars hissed past on wet pavement, and the air smelled faintly of iron, oil, and cold rainwater. At the edge of an apartment complex not far from Pacific Highway, a man parked his car, locked it, and stepped out into the damp air, heading toward his apartment. His name was Patrick Lee Nelson, a 56-year-old heading home at the end of an ordinary Friday. He walked toward the entrance of the building, keys in hand, then they slipped. Just a small mistake. But the keys fell, bounced once on the curb, and vanished through the narrow metal slots of a storm drain grate. The sound they made when they hit the water below was soft and almost delicate. He crouched, peering down. There they were, his car keys and his house keys, glinting faintly in the runoff a few feet below. Rain trickled through the grate, rippling the reflection. He could almost touch them. It must have looked so simple. Just pull the cover aside, reach down, grab them, and go inside. The drain cover weighed around 50 pounds, cast iron slick with rain, so he braced himself, lifted it, and set it aside. The hole beneath was dark and narrow, just 3 feet deep, half filled with cold runoff. The concrete walls were smooth, funneling into a pipe that disappeared beneath the street. From above, it really didn't look dangerous, just an ugly gap collecting rainwater. So he knelt and leaned in. Maybe he used one hand to steady himself on the edge, while the other reached down. The water below was icy, dark, only 2 feet deep, so he stretched a little further with the tips of his fingers brushing metal, and then somehow his balance shifted. The pavement was slick, and the drain's edges were rounded and wet. His shoes slid suddenly, scraping against the concrete. His body lurched forward, and before he could react, gravity pulled him down hard. His ribs hit the edge of the drain with a dull, wet thud, a sharp, heavy impact that forced the air from his lungs. The sound of it vanished beneath the rain. His hand shot out to grab something, but the smooth surface offered nothing. His chest scraped against concrete as his upper body plunged in. Cold water swallowed his face instantly. It was like being dropped into a bucket of ice. The shock hit before fear did, that instinctive jolt that locks the chest and steals breath. His eyes opened to black water clouded with grit. Runoff burned against his sinuses, carrying the taste of rust, oil, and dirt. He tried to push up, but the narrow walls caught his shoulders. The rough concrete pressed into his collarbones, grinding the skin raw as he fought to lift himself up. Every motion sent echoes slapping through the drain. Dull splashes, the rush of displaced water, and the frantic scraping of shoes against the pavement above. He gasped, but all he drew in was water. It hit his throat like liquid fire. He coughed violently but was bursting against the walls, but the position trapped him in. Each cough drove more water in. His body convulsed with his lungs burning. The reflex to breathe was overpowering everything. His legs kicked against the asphalt, with his shoes slipping uselessly. One heel caught under the heavy grate beside him, wedging tighter each time he tried to push. His fingers clawed against the concrete rim, nails scraping hard enough to leave pale streaks in the grime, but he couldn't find leverage. Inside the drain, the world shrank to sound and pressure. The gurgling of rainwater became deafening, a constant rush pouring past his ears. The cold sank deep into his chest, with his muscles locking up from shock. He tried again to lift himself, but his shoulders were jammed tight. The confined space became a vice. Every second he stayed inverted, the blood rushed to his head, pulsing behind his eyes. His breath came out in ragged, choking bursts that quickly turned to silence. The water stung his eyes, seeping into his nose and throat. The struggle slowed, with the motion turning from desperate to weak. His legs twitched a few more times before going still. His body settled in place, wedged between wet concrete and cold water, with his face hidden just below the surface. Rain continued falling, with small ripples spreading outward where his head had gone under. When someone finally saw, they didn't realize what they were looking at. From the sidewalk, all that showed were his legs, bent at the knees, motionless, half protruding from the drain. The first 911 caller thought it might be a homeless man sleeping, or a prank just gone wrong. Police and firefighters arrived under the yellow light of street lamps, and they found the drain cover lying to the side, with the opening wide and full of dark water. When they pulled him out, his upper body was soaked and pale, his skin cool and slack, with his lips faintly blue. Mud and debris were clung to his hair, and the smell of runoff sharp in the air. There was a faint trail of blood where the edge had scraped his chest open, thin scratches across the ribs where he had tried to fight back out. They laid him on the pavement and started CPR. Water gurgled from his mouth and nose each time they pressed his chest, spilling across the concrete in thin streams. His clothes clung to his body, heavy and dripping puddles forming beneath him. The paramedics counted, pressed, and breathed, but he just didn't respond. By the time they stopped, the water inside the drain had begun to clear again. rain continuing its steady path through the same opening. The grate lay off to the side, streaked with mud and footprints. At the morgue, the examiners documented it all. No head trauma, no broken bones, and no signs of violence. Only the unmistakable indicators of drowning. His lungs were heavy, filled with dirty runoff water and fine grit. Mud coated the inside of his nostrils, with his skin along his chest and shoulders being raw from scraping against concrete. His watch had stopped at 6:42 p.m. Investigators measured everything. The drain's mouth was about 3 feet deep, with 24 inches of water inside. The keys were recovered at the bottom, lying inches from where his face had been, with the metal dulled by silt. They concluded he had leaned in too far, lost balance, and fallen forward. When submerged, he had no space to lift his head or twist free. Gravity had basically held him there until his body gave out. Now, this case didn't really make headlines for long. A brief local report or a passing mention on a TV. The headline was, "Man drowns while trying to retrieve keys from storm drain." That was it. But the scene left behind told the real story. A quiet lot slick with rain, and the reflection of street lights trembling across the pavement, with the water still circling down that same opening where he had vanished. In the old mining town by Wabick, Minnesota, summer comes slow. The air smells like pine and rust, with the streets empty by sundown, and the wind carries faint echoes from the iron pits that stretch for miles beyond the tree line. In June 2023, the silence was interrupted by the search for a man named Brandon Lee Bushman. He was 34 years old and had a warrant out for his arrest, a probation violation tied to an earlier drug possession charge. It wasn't violent, but it meant that if deputies found him, he was going back to jail. For days, they had been checking abandoned buildings, garages, and wooded lots, anywhere someone might hide. He had been seen moving between towns on the range, ducking out of sight, and sleeping where no one would think to look. By the third week of June, the search led officers to a small house at 304 4th Avenue North. The place had been empty for months. No power, no furniture, and no sign of life. It was so abandoned that paint peeled from the siding like curled paper, and the windows were filmed over with dust. When they first stepped inside, it smelled like damp wood and mouse droppings. They went room to room, with flashlights cutting through the still air. There were only beer cans on the counter, a few footprints in the dust, and a door near the back that led to the basement. They checked it briefly, their lights sweeping across old storage boxes, and a large white chest freezer tucked in the corner. Its enamel was chipped and dull, but it looked forgotten. When they left, the report said only one thing: house cleared and no sign of the suspect. Days had passed and Brandon didn't show up anywhere. His family filed a missing report, and flyers went up in nearby towns, but no one had seen him, and the trail grew cold. A week later, someone called the sheriff's office. The property owner had gone by to check the house and said there was a smell coming from inside, something sickly and metallic that grew worse by the hour. When deputies went back, they caught it before they even reached the porch. Inside, the air was thick and humid, clinging to their clothes. The smell wasn't just unpleasant, it was unmistakable. The kind that coats the back of your throat, sweet and coppery, like a rusted coin left too long in water. The source was below the house. In the basement, the air barely moved. The concrete walls were sweating. Against one of them sat that same freezer, lid closed, with a faint reddish streak running down its side where the gasket met the rim. Dust was disturbed around it now, faint drag marks in the concrete. The power cord trailed along the floor, still unplugged. The smell coming from the seam of the lid left no doubt what was inside. When they forced it open, the pressure released in a low hiss. A wave of heat and decay rolled out, the unmistakable stench of decomposition in an enclosed space. Inside, the metal walls were bedded with condensation. Brownish fluid pooled in the corners, thick and gelatinous. The air inside shimmered faintly, heavy with ammonia and rot. Curled against one wall was a body. He was on his side, knees drawn to his chest, hands pressed against the lid. His fingertips were blackened and swollen, with skin sloughing from the nails. The walls above him were streaked with faint scratch marks, desperate, uneven lines etched into the frost-stained steel. His face had turned dark, bloated from the gases that had built up inside. The skin around his mouth and eyes was torn slightly from pressure. The airless space had baked him slowly over days, trapping heat and moisture until his body began to liquefy. A thin metal rod, rusted and bent, was wedged through the outer latch, later identified as a piece from a garden ornament. It had locked the lid from the outside, and investigators couldn't tell whether he had jammed it in a panic or if it had slipped that way accidentally. Either way, it sealed the fate of anyone inside. The odor clung to everything. Deputies stepped back, covering their mouths, but there was no escaping it. The air was heavy, thick with decay and iron. When the medical examiner arrived, they found his clothing intact but soaked through with fluids that had seeped from his body. The lining of the freezer was slick and a thin brown film had gathered beneath him, a mix of condensation, bodily fluids, and the oils from decomposing flesh. The air temperature inside the house had been warm that week, enough to speed decay but not enough to dry it out. There were no stab wounds, no bruises, nor no gunshot injuries. The cause was mechanical and suffocating, asphyxiation in a sealed space. The autopsy confirmed it. His lungs had collapsed inward, the small blood vessels in his eyes and skin had ruptured under pressure, and his fingernails were broken and packed with rust from the freezer's walls. The details told the rest. On that night of the first search, he had been there, hiding. When officers entered the home, he must have gone downstairs and crawled into that freezer, believing it was the safest place to disappear. That choice would have been fatal even under perfect conditions. The freezer he had climbed into was an older model from before 1958, when manufacturers still used mechanical latching handles that locked tight from the outside. Those designs were efficient. They sealed air so well that the cold never escaped, but there were also death traps. Once the lid shut, the pressure of the vacuum and the strength of the latch meant it could not be pushed open from inside. After several children suffocated in similar freezers during the 1950s, the US government banned that design. Newer models use magnetic seals and internal release levers. The one in that basement was from the generation that nearly vanished. Heavy, airtight, and utterly unforgiving. He might have realized it almost immediately. The first few breaths would have felt heavy, humid, and unclean. Then dizziness, then the instinct to push up, to grab at the lid, to claw. The scratches on the interior showed that he had fought for a while, long enough to leave marks, but not long enough to make a sound anyone could hear. The rod and the latch told the rest of the story, a final hopeless attempt to wedge the lid open from the inside. When oxygen ran out, the body's panic fades into confusion. He would have grown sluggish, then limp, slipping into unconsciousness before the air was fully gone. Inside that box, it was quiet again. The police department ruled the death accidental. There was no signs anyone else had been in there. No fingerprints other than his, and no forced entry. He had trapped himself in a machine built to be unbreakable. When the freezer was removed, the underside of the lid was rusted with blood, sweat, and faint oils from the decomposition gases that had risen upward. Investigators described the smell as almost unbearable, a mixed sour rot, ammonia, and rust that soaked into the concrete floor. In the end, there was no mystery left to solve. The real horror was how ordinary everything had seemed. Just a missing man and an empty house and a relic from another century that looked harmless until someone lifted that lid and saw what had been waiting there all along. The summer heat in Contra Costa County had been relentless that week. By late afternoon, the hills around Brentwood shimmered behind a pale curtain of dust and dry air. The land out there feels almost empty. Long stretches of farmland, dry canals, and gravel roads that lead to nowhere in particular. A set of railroad tracks run through it all, straight and unbending, cutting across open fields like a scar. On June 26, 2022, a silver sedan made its way along one of those back roads. Inside were Mercedes Regulado, her relatives Julia Mondragon, Maria Nieves, and 2 children. They were heading towards town. The car moved slowly over the uneven dirt, with tires crunching over rocks. The road ahead led to a rail crossing that gave no warning, so no red flashing lights, no ringing bell, and no barrier arms lowering to block the path. Just a faded wooden crossbuck sign that read railroad crossing, half hidden behind tall grass. There were no alarms, no sirens, and no motion sensors. Nothing mechanical to announce that a train was coming. Drivers were left to trust their eyes and ears alone. On a quiet evening like that, with the wind moving through the fields and the sun dropping low, silence could trick you, and even more with the tracks looking empty. From a distance, nothing seemed dangerous. The fields were quiet except for the wind, but far down the line, something massive was moving. the Amtrak St. Joaquin number 713, running its route from Stockton to Martinez. Inside the train were 85 passengers and 5 crew members. It had just left Antioch minutes earlier, running on time. At that hour, the sun was low enough to throw glare across the tracks. For anyone driving west, the light was blinding. It washed the rails and horizon into one color. The sound of the train doesn't really carry far in open air. There were no buildings to echo the horn and no city walls to amplify it. It can be close before you can even hear it. The car reached the crossing. Dust trailed behind it, swirling in the heat. The driver slowed and the front tires bumped over the first rail. Maybe someone saw a flash of metal in the distance, or maybe not, because there was no warning system to tell them a train was coming. Down the track, the Amtrak engineer leaned on the horn. The sound tore through the air, long and shrill, cutting through the dry wind. Inside the sedan, the sound would have arrived as a sudden deafening blare, too loud to make sense of it and too close to escape. The ground itself began to tremble, a deep vibration rolling through wheels of the car. Now, the train was traveling around 80 miles per hour, and in that moment, 400 tons of steel were closing in at a speed that no human could react to. The driver's foot likely pressed the gas too late. There was a flash of sunlight across the windshield, then the shadow of the locomotive filled the entire left side of the car. Witnesses later said it looked like the car hesitated, stopped halfway across as if unsure whether to go forward or back. Then the train struck. The impact came with a sound no one forgets, a metallic crack that turned into a single rippling explosion. The locomotive hit the car broadside, with the driver's side imploding under the force. Windows bursted outward in a spray of glass that sparkled for a heartbeat before scattering into the dirt. The body of the car twisted mid-air, torn open like a foil. It spun twice, pieces breaking free, the trunk, the hood, the doors, and then slammed into the ground 60 feet from the rails. Inside the train, passengers felt a violent jolt. It was the whole cabin lurching sideways. Cups toppled, luggage shifted, and then came a long, grinding screech as the engineer hit the brakes. Outside, the air filled with dust and the scent of burning rubber. The sedan lay mangled in the ditch, with its roof crushed inward and the sides folding tight as if the entire car had been compressed into itself. Bits of the upholstery and paper flooded in the heat, with a door lay half buried in the dirt, still smoldering from friction. First responders from Contra Costa County arrived within minutes. The air was hot, thick with the smell of gasoline and scorched paint. They could hear the faint ticking of metal cooling in the sun. Steam hissed from what was left of the engine, curling into the sky. The sound when rescuers began cutting through the wreck was almost surgical, the hydraulic spreaders whining, glass cracking under the pressure. The inside of the car was a chaos of bent seats, wires, and torn fabric. Mercedes, seated on the left, had taken the full force of the impact. Her seat was crushed nearly flat against the door frame. The airbag had deployed but shredded instantly under the collision's violence. Paramedics reached through what was left of the passenger window. The smell of oil and hot metal mixed with the copper tang of blood. They worked quickly, cutting through twisted belts, with hands moving carefully despite the heat radiating off the wreck. Dust clung to their gloves, turning to paste with sweat. 2 women, Julia and Maria, were already beyond help. Their bodies lay still amid the wreckage, one slumped forward and the other pinned beneath seats. The children were motionless at first, their faces streaked with dust and eyes closed, but one was breathing. It was shallow and erratic, but they were pulled free on a backboard, skin pale under a coating of grit. The other was unresponsive and lifted into the arms of a firefighter who whispered to him as they ran toward the ambulance. Inside the train, passengers pressed against their windows. From the distance, they could see the wreck only in fragments. A glint of chrome, the shimmer of heat, and the red of emergency lights flashing against the car's torn frame. Some covered their mouths and others simply stared. Investigators arrived within the hour, documenting everything. The crossing was a private dirt road with no barriers, no lights, and no alarms. Only the wooden sign that read railroad crossing, like I said earlier. The rails ran straight for miles, yet the glare of the sun and the quiet of the countryside made it deceptively invisible. They marked where the car's tires had stopped, where the debris began, and where the bodies had landed. The coroner's team began their work. They noted the violence of the forces involved. Metal compressed into metal, with glass pulverized into dust. For Mercedes Regalado, the injuries were catastrophic. The collision had been instant, leaving no time for pain and no breath long enough for realization. As dusk fell, floodlights illuminated the site. The air was cold, but the smell of the wreck remained. Trains stopped running through Brentwood that night. The Amtrak engine, streaked with dust and fragments of paint, stood motionless on the track, its steel body dented and silent. By morning, aerial photos captured what words could barely describe: a stretch of scorched dirt, the black outline of skid marks, and a field scattered with remnants of lives, a child's shoe, and a purse flung yards from the wreck. The reports that followed confirmed what physics already told. The car had no chance. The impact speed, the weight of the locomotive, and the lack of protection at the crossing made it inevitable. The deaths of all involved were road accidental, the result of a collision at an unguarded rail crossing. The boy that was responsive unfortunately died later in the hospital. In the months that followed, the family sought accountability. The absence of any lights or gates, the same silence that had doomed the car, became the core of a lawsuit filed in federal courts. The case Nieves et.al. versus BNSF Railroad Company et.al. accused the railroad of negligence and wrongful death, arguing that the unprotected crossing made the tragedy inevitable. Filed in the Northern District of California, the suit targeted BNSF, a railroad company, the owner of the line, and possibly other responsible parties. The plaintiffs are relatives of Mariah and the other victims. They claimed the company failed to provide even basic safety measures, despite knowing the crossing risks. As of now, the case continues, with no settlement reached, a slow legal echo of that moment that took their lives. At the vigil in Antioch, candles flickered against family photos. The air was still the kind of silence that feels too big. On one of the posters, Mercedes smiled in a family picture, the same smile frozen in time. 18-year-old Jordan Camp was spending the day with his father, Eric, at a property in Talmadge Township located in Ottawa County, Michigan. It was a quiet summer afternoon. The property had a large metal outbuilding used for storage, a structure with a wide hangar-style garage door meant for vehicles and heavy equipment. The building wasn't actually part of their home. It was a secondary site used by the family to store tools, farming equipment, and materials for Eric's contracting work. Earlier in the week, Eric had noticed that the overhead garage door wasn't opening correctly. It had started to jam partway up and hang unevenly. So that afternoon, he and Jordan went to the property to take a look at it and figure out what was wrong before it got any worse. To explain this door, it was built from several connected steel panels that rolled upward on vertical tracks. This system worked using torsion springs and steel cables mounted above the opening. When these parts are properly balanced, they offset the full weight of the door, which allowed it to open and close smoothly. Each spring stores a significant amount of mechanical energy, and when one breaks or a cable slips, all of that stored tension releases all at once, which can cause the entire structure to fail. So that day, the door wasn't working correctly, like I said in the beginning. One side hung lower than the other, and the track appeared slightly bent. Now, the cables on the right side were loose, and the spring above the header looked uneven, so Eric and Jordan went to look at it, likely planning to figure out whether it could be stabilized or needed replacement parts. So it wasn't really a formal repair job, more of an inspection to determine if Eric would need to call a technician or handle it himself. Now, the door was large, about 10 to 12 feet tall, and wide enough for equipment to pass through. It was constructed of heavy gauge steel panels with crossbars, right? And it weighed somewhere between 500 and 700 pounds, so it was very heavy. Now, Jordan was standing near the center of the opening, possibly crouched down or leaning to inspect the rollers, while his father stood a few feet away, watching the side mechanism. Now, they didn't appear to be using any tools, just examining the problem. Then, without warning, the right torsion spring broke. Like I said earlier, when a steel spring like that snaps, it releases a sudden burst of energy, similar to like a gunshot. At that same moment, one of the lifting cables tore free from its fitting, so without no counterweight to support it, the full door dropped instantly from its top position. And of course, it fell straight down, with the lower edge striking Jordan across his upper chest and head. Now, this impact was so violent that afterward, there would be an indent in the concrete below, but the steel panels still connected collapsed like a wall of metal, driving him backward onto the concrete floor. The door pinned his upper body beneath it, trapping him under several hundred pounds of pressure. Eric naturally ran to lift the door but couldn't move it. Even a small portion of the weight was impossible to lift without any equipment, so he called 911. Neighbors who heard the noise, a sharp crack followed by the heavy slam, came running. They found the door lying flat against the ground and Eric trying to reach his son underneath. When Ottawa County Sheriff's deputies and paramedics arrived, they used hydraulic spreaders and crowbars to lift the panels, just enough to pull Jordan free. Obviously, he was not breathing and he showed no pulse. Paramedics began resuscitation, performing chest compressions and checking for signs of life, but his injuries were just too severe. First responders later documented the scene in detail. The door's lower panel had struck with such a force that the concrete floor beneath showed faint impact marks, like I said before. Jordan's upper body had been pinned completely under the center section of the door, with one of the steel hinges bent inward from the weight. Paramedics attempted advanced life support procedures for several minutes, including airway management and cardiac monitoring, but there was no return of vital signs, and he was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner's report listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma. Jordan had sustained extensive injuries. Multiple skull fractures, a crushed ribcage, a broken sternum, and internal bleeding in the chest cavity. His lungs had essentially collapsed under the pressure, and his cervical spine was fractured. The report concluded that death was instantaneous due to catastrophic head and chest trauma. Deputies examined the garage door assembly closely. The torsion spring above the right track had split into two pieces, showing clear signs of fatigue, which were small cracks along the metal surface that had likely developed over months or even years. The cable on the same side had snapped at the end fitting, recoiling upward and embedding itself into the wooden frame. The track was bent and distorted, confirming that the door had fallen straight down under full load. After the investigation, the damaged door was removed and replaced with a new system. Mechanical specialists later explained that doors of this size and type require regular maintenance, particularly checking and replacing torsion springs every few years. Springs under tension can wear out eternally long before visible cracks appear, and when one finally breaks, the result is a complete collapse that happens too fast for anyone to react. From a physics standpoint, a 600-pound door falling from a height of 10 feet can hit the ground at roughly 22 to 25 miles per hour, generating over 5,000 pounds of force at impact. Even a partial strike to the torso is fatal. The bottom panel in this case hit Jordan directly at full speed, producing injuries consistent with immediate death. Jordan's funeral took place several days later in Coopersville, attended by family, classmates, and community members. He was remembered as polite and hardworking. On the morning of December 4th, 2021, Kim Taylor, a 73-year-old woman from Wesley, Massachusetts, was volunteering at Cultivate Care Farms in Bolton. The farm is a nonprofit that combines agriculture with therapy, allowing people to interact with farm animals as part of mental health programs. Taylor had volunteered there for several years. She was part of a long-term volunteer team responsible for day-to-day care of the animals. She had completed the farm's training for animal handling and was considered experienced enough to work independently in the enclosures. Her typical duties included feeding, cleaning pens, refilling water troughs, and assisting in the farm's therapy sessions with children and adults. That morning began like any other workday for the farm's volunteers. Around 9 a.m., Taylor was assigned to care for the sheep enclosure, which housed several sheep and a full-grown ram. Her task was to feed the animals and check their water supply, so she entered the pen like usual carrying a bucket of feed, then closed the gate behind her and began the usual process. Now, to give some context about this ram, in the weeks leading up to this day, the ram had reportedly shown mild territorial behavior, which looks like pawing at the dirt, pacing, and occasionally ramming the fence. These behaviors are typical in the late fall and early winter breeding season, when male sheep become more aggressive and protective of their territory. But the staff believed the behavior was manageable, but such aggression can escalate rapidly. Now, while Taylor was spreading feed, the ram became agitated. Like I said before, the best way to explain this was because of mating season, as Taylor wasn't trying to piss it off. But either way, the ram lowered its head and charged without warning. The first impact drove the hard frontal plate of the ram's skull into Taylor's torso, lifting and knocking her backward. which would make her fall to the ground. As she attempted to move, the animal backed up and struck her again, targeting the chest and upper abdomen. Rams typically repeat blows in short intervals, and this animal delivered multiple hits in rapid succession. Now, to better explain why she couldn't just get up and leave the enclosure, this sheep enclosure itself was a fenced-in area roughly 20 by 25 feet, bordered by wooden posts and wire fencing about 4 to 5 feet high. There was a single gate for entry and exit. So once Taylor was inside and the attack began, there was little to no room to maneuver. Not only that, she was very old, but the narrow space meant she couldn't escape quickly, and other volunteers couldn't safely enter without risking injury. When a ram attacks, the strikes come from close range, which leaves little opportunity to sidestep or defend against the blows, and these impacts cause injuries through a combination of blunt force and compression. A mature ram weighing 150 to 200 pounds can accelerate enough over a short distance to deliver force sufficient to fracture ribs and the sternum, compress the heart and lungs, and tear blood vessels. And in Taylor's case, the reported hits produced severe chest trauma. Witnesses who reached her within moments found her unresponsive or barely responsive, with shallow or absent breathing and signs consistent with traumatic cardiac arrest. Bruising spread quickly across the chest wall, and there was concern for hemorrhagic, which is bleeding into the chest cavity, and pulmonary contusion, which is bruised lung tissue. Given the locations of the strikes, flailed chest, which is segments of ribcage detached to multiple fractures, was also likely. Other volunteers entered the pen to drive off the ram and pull Taylor clear of the gate area. One volunteer started CPR while another called 911. Now, there was no safe way to continue care inside the pen due to the animal's behavior, so they moved her a short distance away and maintained compressions. Because of the mechanism of the injury, repeated blows to the chest, bystanders focused on circulation and airway, monitoring for vomiting or blood in the mouth, which can occur with lung injury, and continuing compressions when no pulse was detected. Paramedics from the Bolton Fire Department and police officers arrived within minutes. EMS took over advanced life support. Standard trauma care in this situation includes continuous CPR, airway management, and rapid assessment for chest injuries. When trauma causes the chest cavity to fill with blood or air, decomposition procedures may be performed in the field. Given the blood mechanism, responders focused on restoring circulation and oxygenation and moved quickly to transport. EMS reports later indicated that Taylor had no detectable pulse when crews arrived. Despite ongoing CPR, there were no signs of spontaneous breathing or circulation. She was intubated in the field, placed on the cardiac monitor, and transported under active resuscitation, although the monitor showed no electrical activity in the heart, which is an indication that her cardiac structures had suffered catastrophic injury or major vessel rupture. Taylor was taken to the Marlborough Hospital, and on arrival, the trauma team continued resuscitation. Hospital efforts in a case like this typically conclude intubation if not already completed, bilateral chest evaluation with immediate chest x-ray or bedside ultrasound, and blood transfusion if available and indicated. The combination of catastrophic chest injuries, internal bleeding, and cardiac arrest was not survivable, and she was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Detectives from the Bolton Police Department and Massachusetts State Police, working with the Worcester County District Attorney's Office, conducted a standard investigation. They examined the scene, photographed the enclosure, and recorded statements from staff and volunteers. The fence was in fact intact. The gate was secured, and Taylor had followed normal volunteer protocols. There was no evidence of equipment failure or improper handling. With that, investigators found no negligence or misconduct by the farm or staff. The Office of Chief Medical Examiner performed an autopsy and determined for multiple blunt force injuries caused by repeated ramming. Documented findings included multiple rib fractures, sternal fracture, and significant internal hemorrhage. The autopsy noted bilateral rib fractures, crushed sternum, and internal injuries consistent with high-energy blunt trauma. There was no defensive wounds, suggesting she was overwhelmed almost immediately after the first strike. The official cause of death was listed as accidental blunt force trauma. Cultivate Care Farms temporarily closed after the incident. The organization issued a public statement expressing condolences to Taylor's family and confirming cooperation with investigators. The statement described her as a dedicated volunteer who had spent years helping at the farm. Following this investigation, animal control officers worked with the farm the disposition of the ram involved. The animal was removed from the property and, according to local reporting at the time, euthanized once authorities determined it could not safely return to a public-facing setting. After the incident, Cultivate Care Farms reviewed its animal safety protocols with assistance from the Massachusetts Department of Agricultural Resources. The farm revised procedures to prohibit solo entry into pens with adult male livestock, added additional supervision during feeding times, and implemented refresher training for volunteers on recognizing aggressive body language in rams. Other therapy farms in the region followed suit, updating their own safety protocols and installing double gate systems to allow faster exit during emergencies. Now, fatal ram attacks are rare, but they have been documented in agricultural safety data. Reports from the National Agricultural Safety Database and similar sources show that most severe incidents often occur when handlers underestimate how fast a ram can close the distance inside a pen. Even smaller rams can generate impact forces exceeding 1,000 pounds at a short range. The majority of fatal cases involve blows to the chest or abdomen that lead to massive internal bleeding or heart rupture within minutes. The Bolton Police Department classified the case as an accident and closed the investigation, which meant no charges were filed and no violations were issued against the farm. In late July 2013, Roger Murrow, a 56-year-old man living in condo complex in Palatine, Illinois, realized something small had gone wrong in his day. Something that would set off a chain of events no one could have imagined. He misplaced his cell phone, and after retracing his steps, he became convinced he might have accidentally dropped it down the building's trash chute while throwing away garbage. Roger lived with his wife, Donna, in the Willow Creek condos on East Dundee Quarter Drive. He was legally blind, but that didn't stop him from maintaining his independence. He walked everywhere, used public transportation, and handled most of his daily routines without assistance. Now, at around 6 p.m., he decided to search the basement where the trash chute emptied into the building's industrial compactor, which is a heavy-duty machine used to compress refuse into dumpster below. But access to that specific utility room was restricted, but Roger asked a member of the condo board for the key, which the board member obliged, handing it over without offering to escort him or disable the machinery. Now, there was no posted warnings near the compactor, and no lockout procedures in place to ensure the machine was shut down while someone was inside the area. Now, the trash room itself was quite small. It was just a concrete space with a single overhead light, housing the chute and a hydraulic compactor roughly the size of a small car. The compactor had a wide steel hopper with smooth walls leading down to the chamber where the trash was compressed. A short aluminum ladder stood nearby, positioned against the hopper's opening. Investigators later determined that Roger likely used the ladder to look down into the compactor, hoping to spot his phone or a plastic bag that might contain it. But at some point, while leaning forward over the hopper, Roger either slipped or was struck by falling trash from above, which would result with him falling directly into the loading chamber, which is the part of the machine that collects the refuse before it's compacted, if you didn't know. Now, the chamber was a confined metal box with slick sides coated in residue, and once inside, there was no grip or handle to climb back out. See, this wouldn't really be too bad, but the compactor operated automatically using a photoelectric sensor that detected obstructions in the chamber, and when his body broke this beam, the sensor triggered the compactor's compression cycle, so the hydraulic ram, a steel plate powered by a piston, began to move forward, driving inward several tons of force. Now, what made this all even worse was there was no emergency shutoff inside the chamber, and no way to escape once the cycle started. Now, to explain how the machine's hydraulic system worked, it builds pressure rapidly, which produces a low hum, followed by the deep mechanical groan of metal under strain, and when the ram made contact, it crushed with thousands of pounds per square inch. So the first impact likely drove Roger's back and ribs against the rear wall, which would fracture his vertebrae and collapse his chest cavity in an instant. His ribs splintered and folded inward, puncturing his lungs. The force compressed his internal organs, rupturing the liver and spleen, and driving blood into the soft tissue. Now, the hydraulic ram continued advancing, flattening the body further. The steel plate pressed down with such power that it forced bone fragments through muscle and skin. The head and neck were caught at an angle, with the skull fracturing under the pressure, and the cervical vertebrae being snapped. The crushing motion forced blood and bodily fluids outward across the interior walls of the machine. The process was nearly silent except for the groan of the hydraulics and the brief hiss of compressed air escaping the sealed chamber. Death would have nearly been instantaneous, caused by the complete collapse of the chest and skull, massive internal bleeding, and asphyxiation from the pressure crushing the airway and lungs. When Roger didn't return home later that evening, his wife became concerned. By 9:30 p.m., she called police to report him missing, so officers began searching the property, starting with the paths he usually walked. Now, the only reason why they found him was because his cane was found leaning against a wall near the basement trash room, with the door unlocked and the key still in place. Inside, officers discovered the compactor's hopper slightly ajar, with the air inside heavy with heat and the smell of hydraulic oil. They looked down and found Roger's body inside the machine, wedged between the ram and the back plate. His torso was compressed nearly flat, and his head was bent forward unnaturally against his chest. Paramedics confirmed he was deceased at the scene. Recovery required partially retracting the ram. When it pulled back, the crushed debris and fluids released from the chamber spilling onto the floor. His cause of death as multiple crushing injuries to the head, chest, and torso, with the manner of death classified as accidental. The autopsy report described extensive fractures throughout the ribcage and pelvis, with severe skull damage and catastrophic internal injuries consistent with mechanical compression. Investigators examined the compactor and determined that it had functioned exactly as designed. The problem was the absence of safety features. The hopper lacked protective grating, interior lighting, or any accessible emergency stop. The chamber walls were smooth steel, leaving no footholds to climb out. The photoelectric sensor that had triggered the hydraulic press could not distinguish between garbage and a human body, so once triggered, the system completed its cycle automatically, regardless of what was inside. So I did some research and found that commercial compactors of this type produce up to 10,000 pounds of compressive force using hydraulic pistons. Once the cycle begins, the ram moves within seconds, leaving no time for escape. Even a brief delay between activation and impact wouldn't be enough to survive, so death occurs almost instantly from massive internal trauma, which are crushed bones, ruptured organs, and asphyxiation caused by the collapsing chest cavity, which is what happened to Roger. After the recovery, the Palatine Police Department closed the case as an accidental death. However, questions about safety quickly followed. In February 2014, Roger's widow, Donna, filed a wrongful death lawsuit in the Cook County Circuit Court against the Willow Creek Condo Association No. 6 and Hillcrest Property Management, Inc. The lawsuit alleged negligence, stating that Roger was given unsupervised access to a dangerous area, that no warnings were posted, and that the compactor was left operational when it should have been shut down. Court filings described the machine as a hidden hazard and pointed out, fairly I might add, that its design offered no internal safety devices, no emergency stop switches, and no visible danger signage. The suit also criticized the property's lack of formal lockout/tagout procedures, which is a standard safety practice requiring power to be cut down before anyone enters or works near mechanical equipment. Investigations documented the scene thoroughly. The ladder was stable, the lighting adequate, and there was no indication that Roger had tampered with any electrical components. The compactor's automatic trigger was tested and found to be in normal working condition. It activated the same way each time the hopper was blocked, confirming that the machine had crushed Roger within moments of his fall. The wrongful death lawsuit argued that his tragedy could have been prevented by simple precautions, disabling the power, locking the room, or accompanying Roger during his search. Attorneys for the family stated that granting him the key and leaving him unsupervised effectively placed him in a high-risk mechanical zone without any protection. Now, the lawsuit was eventually settled privately. Though the terms were confidential, the case served as an example in discussions about condo safety and mechanical liability. Brian Jewell was 17, still in high school, and like a lot of teenagers in October, he wanted a little extra money. There was a haunted hayride that needed people, so he signed up. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was a job, even though the pay wasn't much. But it was steady, and he liked that it gave him something to do at night instead of hanging around. Now, this is important to know. Brian was quiet but dependable. He didn't drink, he didn't mess around, and he was like one of those serious kids. If you told him to be somewhere, he was there. Now, he had been given a relatively small role. He didn't have to act much or even speak a lot, as the guests would just pass by on the wagons. A fake gallows had been built to make it look like a hanging, so the idea of this was straightforward and simple. So the wagon would stop, he'd deliver a few lines, then pretend to be hanged while the group watched. It was supposed to look real without actually being dangerous, like a little fun, scary thing. But I'm sure you're wondering how this actually worked, and this is how the crew explained it. The rope wasn't meant to hold any weight, and his feet would always stay on the ground. Now, to make sure everything would go smoothly, the scene had been tested before the crowds arrived, and everything looked fine. So when the first wagons came through, Brian did everything right. The tractor pulled up, the guests laughed nervously, and he said his lines. People gasped when the noose tightened around his neck, exactly how the script intended. The rope creaked under tension and the beam above groaned just enough to sound real. The spotlight flickered across his pale face, and his head tilted slightly to one side. It was convincing, unsettling, and the wagon moved on exactly on cue. He reset for the next group, loosening the noose and rubbing his neck where the rough hemp had pressed against his skin. It went smoothly for a while, but as the night went on, things started to blur together. The same lines, the same reactions, and the same wagon lights crawling against the field. Around him, other actors shouted and jumped out of the dark. People screamed, then laughed, so he's been hearing this on repeat. He could hear the tractor engines rumbling, the faint smell of exhaust mixing with damp autumn air. Sweat gathered under his collar despite the cold, and the rope brushed against the same spot on his throat over and over until it left a faint red mark. Now, at some point, the driver of the wagon reached Brian's stop again. He slowed down and waited for the speech, but nothing happened. He waited another few seconds, thinking Brian was just throwing in some extra suspense. But the silence kept going. Now that wasn't like him. He was always on cue for that whole night. He always said the exact same thing every time. So the driver shut off the tractor and climbed out, obviously confused. Now, from where he stood, Brian looked perfectly in character. So he was still, head slightly tilted, and feet on the ground, just like every time before. The light from the tractor hit his face, and for a moment it looked flawless, like the perfect performance. His eyes were half open, fixed on nothing. The guests were whispering, not sure if it was part of the show or not. The driver called out to him, but he didn't move. He got closer, then closer again, and finally realized it wasn't an act. He yelled for help, staff came running, and when they reached him, his skin had already turned pale, a bluish tint creeping along his lips. His body was limp, and when they lifted him, his head slumped forward, with the noose digging deeper into the flesh around his throat. They grabbed the rope and lifted it off, trying to get him loose. Someone ran for a phone, and the guests were rushed off the wagon and sent back to the parking area. Some were crying, and some just froze in shock. No one understood what had happened yet. When paramedics arrived, they took over, but it was already clear that it was really bad. There was no pulse. His neck bore a deep line where the rope had pressed, the fibers leaving sprawling imprints. His eyes were open just enough to make it worse. Not wide, but unfocused, as if he had frozen mid-expression. What everyone thought was a prop scene had somehow become real. The ride was immediately shut down. Police arrived, then investigators, and later the medical examiner. They checked the gallows and the rope. The noose was frayed where it had rubbed against the beam, strands torn just enough to catch and tighten without release. Everything that had seemed safe earlier in the night was re-examined. His feet had been touching the ground, just like the set required, but the rope had tightened enough to stop his breathing. Investigators later found that the rope's counterweight system had jammed. It was designed to keep the noose loose no matter how he moved, but when it snagged against the beam above, the tension locked tight around his throat. And because his feet were still on the ground, no one realized he was actually being strangled. It looked perfect, motionless just like the act was supposed to. People who had gone on the hayride earlier couldn't believe it. No one had noticed it until it was too late. The last wagon of the night had rolled past him without realizing the scene wasn't a scene anymore. By morning, the news had spread through the town. People who had gone on the hayride earlier couldn't believe it. Parents called each other, trying to make sense of it. The words freak accident started showing up everywhere, because nobody had any other way to describe it. The owners of the attraction closed it down, and the gallows were taken apart and thrown out. No one wanted to see it again. His parents sat at home while waiting for details that just wouldn't help. The idea that their son had gone to work and never came back didn't make sense, and no explanation was ever going to make it feel fair. The investigation eventually confirmed it was an accident. There was no foul play, no prank gone wrong. After that, every haunted attraction in the area changed its rules. Anything involving ropes or neck restraints was banned outright. Nobody wanted to risk another situation like that. It's kinda crazy and sad how a simple Halloween job turned into something that was absolutely horrific. Haunted Hilltop sits just outside Chattanooga, Tennessee. It's a big open property with a dirt lot out front and a trail that runs through the woods in the back. Every October, they turned it into one of those Halloween attractions. So basically a hayride, a haunted house, people in costumes, loud music, fog machines, the whole setup. Locals go there every year. Friday night, October 11th, 2024, it was packed. Families were showing up in groups, teenagers hanging around in hoodies, with younger kids running between the food stalls. The hayride was the main thing though. It was a big green tractor that pulled a flatbed trailer stacked with hay bales. It took people down a path lined with fake tombstones and jump scare spots. The ride looped around and came back to the lot every 15 minutes or so. Now 12-year-old Samuel Jensen was there with some friends. They had gotten dropped off earlier that night by, I'm guessing, one of the kids' parents. Now they weren't on the hayride yet. They were just walking around the open area near the trail where the trailers come back around. Now keep this in mind. The ground there was rough. It had uneven dirt, some patches of grass, and a small hill that led up to the main path. You could actually see the headlights from the tractors cutting through the fog into the engines before the wagons even came into view. Now the group of kids had been hanging around there for a while, talking and laughing, running in the dark like kids usually do when there's no one telling them not to. A few adults nearby said they had seen them moving closer to the edge of the path each time a hayride came by. Now this wasn't the first group of kids to do that. Kids always tried to get close to the wagons to spook riders or just mess around. But they had no one to really watch and keep these kids from doing that. Keep that in mind as well. So it was sometime around 10:30 when another tractor came through. The driver was an older man who had worked there before, so he drove slow, maybe 5 miles per hour. I don't really know the exact speed, but it was just enough to keep the ride moving while people on board looked around waiting for the next scare. The trailer behind him was full of parents, kids, and with some teenagers, but everyone was sitting on the hay bales, and these hay bales were facing outward, so they could only see what was in front of them, or eye level, and even at that it was hard because all of the fog. But either way, when the wagon reached the area near the hill, the kids were standing close again. Witnesses later said Samuel ran forward as the trailer passed. Now no one's like 100% sure, but some said he tried to grab onto the wooden side rail of the wagon, although others thought he might have been trying to hop on for a second and then jump off. But either way, he slipped. Now remember what I said earlier about the ground. It was not flat, and there were loose rocks and mud from rain earlier that week. So the moment his foot went out from under him, he fell sideways under the trailer. His shoulder and head struck the metal frame first, the impact snapping his neck backward. Before he could move or even shout, one of the trailer's rear wheels rolled over him. The weight of the wagon and its passengers, which is several tons, crushed his torso against the ground. The tire passed across his chest and abdomen, breaking ribs and rupturing organs. The impact forced blood from his mouth and nose instantly. And what makes this even worse, the people on board didn't even realize what happened, because of the noise of the engine and the screams from the haunted setup drowned everything out. Now remember, the driver couldn't see him from the seat as the tractor's lights pointed straight ahead, and with the noise of the engine and the people on board screaming and laughing, he didn't hear anything, nor did anyone in the trailer. Like I said before, the riders faced outward on hay bales, stacked along the sides of the flatbed trailer. Now the wooden rails on the trailer came up to about chest height when you were sitting, and the hay bales themselves added a barrier that blocked anything below the edge. So if someone fell alongside or under the wagon, you simply couldn't see it from where you were sitting. Not only that, the trailer's floor sat about 2.5 to 3 feet off the ground, and the wheels were set underneath that flatbed, so anyone lying next to or even under the wheel line would be completely hidden unless you were standing and looking down from the side, which riders weren't allowed to do while the wagon was moving. So the ride just kept going on like normal. It was only when the other kids started yelling for him to stop. It took a few seconds for anyone to realize they weren't joking. When the driver finally stopped the tractor, people on the trailer started to get off because they thought the ride was over, right? And that's when they saw Samuel on the ground near the side of the trailer. He was lying partially under the hay and motionless. His shirt was torn and his body twisted at an angle that didn't look right. One leg was pinned beneath the edge of the wagon and the dirt underneath him was dark and wet. Someone yelled for help and people ran over. A few tried CPR while another person called 911. When they pressed on his chest, there was little resistance because several ribs had been broken inward and blood filled his airway. His friends stood back crying and shouting his name, unsure what to do. The first call to dispatch came in at 10:45 p.m. Deputies from the Hamilton County Sheriff's Office were sent to the haunted hilltop along with paramedics. They got there within minutes and started working on him right away. Medics inserted an airway tube and tried to restart his heart, but his injuries were just too catastrophic. His chest had literally collapsed from the crush, and the internal bleeding was massive. They worked for nearly 20 minutes before pronouncing him dead at the scene. The area was cleared out, everyone who had been on the ride was moved back toward the parking lot, and the staff shut the whole event down. Deputies interviewed the driver, the workers, and the witnesses, and everyone's story was the same. The tractor and the trailer were checked and everything was working fine. There was nothing broken or unsafe about this ride. It wasn't a malfunction or a setup issue. It was just one of those things that happens in a second and can't be undone. The attraction stayed closed for the rest of the night. The owners shut off the lights, sent everyone home, and told staff to stay until investigators finished. The deputies were there for hours taking photos and measurements and writing their report. A few days later, a GoFundMe was started for Samuel's family, and people from all over the county donated. His teammates held a candle vigil on the football field, and his number was written on their helmets. When the sheriff's office finished the report, they ruled it an accident. There was no foul play, no negligence, and no one was charged. It was really just bad timing and one mistake that turns into something no one could take back. After that, people started talking about safety at hayrides and haunted attractions in Tennessee. Reporters fairly pointed out that the state doesn't have strict safety laws for temporary events like this. Rides like Haunted Hilltop's Hayride don't require state inspection because they're not classified as amusement parks, so everything's left up to the operators. And the weeks after, some attractions in the area added fences and ropes along their routes to keep people from standing too close. Haunted Hilltop stayed closed for the rest of the season, and the owners said they didn't even know if they'd ever reopen it. It was Halloween night 2013 and West Hollywood, California. The streets along Santa Monica Boulevard were flooded with people, literally thousands of them, and they were all dressed up in every costume imaginable. The West Hollywood Halloween Carnival was one of the biggest events in Los Angeles County, so it drew around 500,000 people every year, turning several blocks into a giant open-air party. There were flashing lights, music from outdoor stages, drinks everywhere, and crowds so dense that moving from one block to another could take damn near 15 minutes. But among that crew was a 51-year-old man named Gilbert Estrada. He'd been coming to this event for years, practically every Halloween. Friends later said he loved the atmosphere, the energy, the costumes, and the sense of community. That night, he arrived in a costume like everyone else. He was wearing a homemade outfit made of burlap, straw, and fabric stripes. So kind of like camouflage or the ghillie sniper look. Something out of like Call of Duty Modern Warfare, if you know what that is. It was rough and layered, like something a hunter might wear. The costume was eye-catching, but what no one realized was how dangerous the materials actually were. We'll get into this later. But as I said before, the carnival stretched for blocks, right? With police officers monitoring traffic and keeping the crowds in designated zones. So around 10 o'clock, the streetlights mixed with the colored floodlights from the main stage. Music was blaring, people were laughing, and some people were even smoking or lighting sparklers. Small things that didn't seem like much in the moment. The temperature had dropped slightly, but it was still warm enough for people to be out late in thin costumes. Gilbert was somewhere near the intersection of Santa Monica Boulevard and San Vicente Boulevard, standing among hundreds of other people gathered by one of the event's side areas. Witnesses said he was talking with a few people and may have been smoking a cigarette or holding one of these lighters. No one saw exactly how it started, but in a matter of seconds, his costume caught on fire. At first, the people around him didn't realize what was happening because the crowd was thick, and most assumed it was some kind of prop or for some reason part of his outfit. but the burlap and straw fabric ignited almost instantly, and within moments, the flames spread across his torso and up his back. Those materials are dry and fibrous, which burn fast and hot. The costume basically acted like kindling. The first flash burned through the outer layer, then the flames tunneled underneath, trapping heat between his skin and the fabric. Someone shouted and then the panic started. People began backing away as the fire grew. A few tried to help, but in a dense crowd, it wasn't easy. A woman nearby threw a drink on him, trying to smother the flames. Others started ripping pieces of his costume off while shouting for water or fire extinguishers. But by then his arms and chest were fully engulfed. Witnesses saw skin beginning to blister and peel from the heat. The smell of the burning straw mixed with that of burned fabric and flesh. The heat was intense. People close by felt it on their faces. Gilbert screamed and stumbled, clawing at the costume, but it clung to him. The burlap fibers, once lit, fused with the melting synthetic lining, so his hands would have stuck to the material with the skin on his palms, tearing as he tried to pull it away. The fire reached his face and neck, blackening the side of his jaw and singeing his hair. It only took a few seconds for the fire to completely engulf him. Witnesses described him as being on fire like a torch. A nearby security guard ran with a jacket, trying to beat out the flames. Another person threw their own costume cape over him to try to smother the fire, but when the flames were finally knocked down, his upper body was charred, dark, and smoking. The remains of the costume had melted into his skin in places, and his breathing was shallow and raspy from inhaling hot air. Parts of his throat and airway had been seared. The music had stopped by then, with organizers noticing the commotion and radioing for help. The smell of burning fabric and smoke filled the air, and the crowd around the scene broke apart as firefighters and paramedics rushed in. Firefighters from the Los Angeles County Fire Department arrived quickly, given that the emergency crews were already stationed along the carnival route. They managed to extinguish the remaining flames and immediately began emergency treatment right there on the street. The burns covered nearly his entire upper body, so his arms, shoulders, chest, and face. And the exposed tissue beneath was gray-white, the hallmark of full-thickness burns. Paramedics covered him with sterile burn sheets, started IV fluids, and gave oxygen through a mask, but his pulse was fading. The ambulance took him to the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, less than 10 minutes away. Emergency staff were already prepping for his arrival because dispatch had called in a full burn victim. Paramedics worked to stabilize him during transport and giving oxygen and IV fluids while trying to manage the damage to his airway from inhaling superheated air and smoke. At the hospital, doctors assessed that he had suffered third-degree burns over roughly 80% of his body's surface. His airway was severely damaged and the skin on his torso was almost completely destroyed. Burn trauma of that extent leads to shock and rapid organ failure if not controlled. So they placed him on life support while working to rehydrate and regulate his body temperature. But despite hours of treatment, which were fluid resuscitation, ventilator support, and medications to stabilize his heart, the internal damage was just too severe. The heat had destroyed the muscle tissue and caused his organs to fail. By early the next morning, word had spread that the man who had caught on fire at the West Hollywood Halloween Carnival had not survived. The sheriff's department confirmed his identity as Gilbert Estrada of Los Angeles County. Investigators from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and the arson unit looked into how the fire started. There was no evidence of any foul play or any intentional act. Detectives concluded that the fire was accidental, most likely caused when Gilbert's costume came into contact with an open flame, possibly from a lighter or cigarette. The materials, burlap, straw, and synthetic fibers are extremely flammable. When exposed to even a small flame, they ignite fast and burn hotter than normal cotton or polyester. Officials used the incident to warn the public about costume safety. They explained that many people don't realize how dangerous certain fabrics can be when mixed with cigarettes, candles, or open flames at outdoor events. Synthetic fibers, untreated burlap, and straw can all ignite in under 2 seconds. And because these costumes often fit loosely, flames get trapped underneath, feeding on air and spreading rapidly. Melville Burhand lived with his wife Anna and their 15-year-old son Anthony on Henley Drive in Palm Bay, Florida. Melville liked building and fixing things around the house. He worked during the day and spent his free time working on small projects. So things like fixing a mower, building a workbench, or putting together antennas for his ham radio. which from my understanding is a personal non-commercial radio system that allows people to communicate directly with others using radio waves rather than the internet or a phone network. Now, he had been into amateur radios for literal years. He loved them. He actually talked to people all over the world through static and signal, and sometimes really late into the night. Now, that week, he had been setting up a new antenna in the yard, which shouldn't be too hard for him as he'd done it plenty of times before. The only difference this time is that the new antenna was taller. It was about 50 feet long, made of lightweight aluminum sections that connected together. The designs of antennas are quite simple. Basically, the higher the antenna, the better the range. And he needed the better range as he wanted to talk to people further away from him, hence why he bought this antenna. But he planned to finish raising it that night, so he could test it the next day. Now, it was already dark, but the air was still and the weather was good, so he decided to keep working. But he couldn't do it himself, so he had his wife and son help him. Anna held the lower part of the pole, while Melville worked on tightening the bolts near the base. Now, they needed someone to keep the top end steady or the whole thing would collapse, which was Anthony's job. Now, they had set a flashlight on the ground so they could see, and the light from the kitchen window also helped them see. Now, this is a very important detail, so keep it in mind. The area they were working in was open, but there were power lines running along the edge of the property. Now, they weren't directly overhead, but they were close enough that if the pole tilted just a few degrees, it could touch them. Now, if you didn't know, these lines carry about 13,000 volts. During the day you could see them clearly, but at night they blended into the darkness. Melville finished adjusting the clamps at the base. He then checked the alignment and told Anthony to start lifting it slow. Together they began to raise the antenna, walking their hands up the pole as it went upright. It was heavy but manageable, as it was something they had done before. Anna steadied it from the side to keep it from tipping. For a while, everything was fine. The pole started to stand straight, the base locked in, and it looked like they were almost done. Then, a small gust of wind pushed the top section, and it didn't take much for the pole to shift just slightly off-center. Melville tried to correct it, tightening his grip. Anthony also stepped closer to help. That's when the top of the pole brushed the overhead power line. Now, there wasn't a spark or even a loud sound at first, just instant contact. The second the metal touched the wire, the full charge went straight through it. So 13,000 volts of electricity traveled down the mast, through every metal joint, and into everyone holding it. The current would hit Melville first as he was the closest. It went through his hands and straight down his arms, through his chest, and out to his feet. Now, clearly the human body isn't built to handle that. It locks everything up instantly, so muscles seize, nerves shut down, and the heart stops in a split second. And like I said so many times on this channel, electricity always looks for a path to the ground. And it found that path through all three of them. Anthony was holding the upper part of the pole, and the current would hit him next. It tore through his body, locking every muscle at once. When that happens, people can't even let go. The voltage forces their hands shut around whatever they're touching. His body jerked hard enough to break tendons and even knock him backward. Anna, trying to pull him away, got hit too. The current jumped into her through direct contact. Neighbors later said they saw a bright flash, a burst of bluish-white light that lit up the yard for a second, followed by darkness. Some thought it was a firework, others thought a transformer had blown, but a few seconds later someone shouted. When neighbors ran outside, they saw smoke rising from the grass. The antenna was down now, stretched across the yard, and the three of them were on the ground near it. The air smelled like ozone and burnt grass. Parts of their clothing were scorched and melted, and the ground around them had turned black in a branching pattern. And if you didn't know, that's what high voltage electricity does when it spreads through the soil. A neighbor called 911, and dispatchers sent multiple units. So police, firefighters, and paramedics. They would all arrive within minutes. But unfortunately, Anna was already gone, although Melville and Anthony still had a faint pulse, but they weren't breathing on their own. Paramedics started CPR and rushed both of them to the Palm Bay Hospital, but despite their efforts, neither survived. The medical examiner later described their injuries as consistent with high voltage electrocution, so deep internal burns, cardiac arrest, and severe tissue damage from the current passing through their bodies. Their shoes had burn marks on the soles where the electricity had exited. Police and investigators stayed through the night, documenting the scene. They examined the antenna, which was still lying across the yard. The aluminum had melted at the point where it touched the power line. It was so bad that parts of it were even fused together. The burn marks in the grass showed exactly where the electricity had traveled after contact. The power company confirmed that the line carried around 13 kilovolts, which is 13,000 volts. Investigators calculated the distance from the antenna base to the power line and determined that it only needed to lean a few degrees off vertical to make contact, but everything else checked out, so there was no signs of tampering or negligence. The final report called it a tragic accident. Melville had experience in building antennas, and he had done everything right except for one detail. He misjudged how close the pole was to the overhead lines. It was dark, the pole was tall, and in that moment, none of them saw the danger above. For the Brahams, it was supposed to be a simple family project, something they had done together dozens of times. They weren't reckless and they weren't rushing, and nothing about it looked unsafe, but all it took was a slight tilt and a few feet of metal in the wrong place, and within seconds, everything was over. The pool at the DoubleTree by Hilton Brook Hollow in Houston was packed that afternoon. Families floated along the lazy river, kids shouted from inflatable tubes, and music played over the speakers. It was late spring and guests were enjoying one of the hotel's main attractions, a looping pool designed to move in slow circles beneath palm trees and hanging lights. Among the families there that day was a Jaco family. They had come from a short getaway. Nothing fancy, just a weekend to relax. Their 8-year-old daughter, Leah Lonte Jaco, loved the water. She spent most of the afternoon laughing, swimming, and floating close to her mom and her younger sister. Now, around 5 in the evening, her mother looked away for only a moment to help her other daughter with a towel. When she looked back, Aaliyah wasn't beside her. She didn't freak out, as she thought maybe Aaliyah had drifted further along the loop of the lazy river, as kids disappear from sight in pools all the time, and most of the time they pop up seconds later. But seconds passed, and then minutes. Her mother called her name. At first, people thought she was just looking for a kid, like any parent would, but when she kept yelling, guests started helping. Some got out of the pool and began checking corners and walkways. Staff were eventually called over, and soon the pool area turned from loud to silent. It really didn't make any sense. How could an 8-year-old little girl disappear, especially that fast? When no one could find her, someone called 911. Houston firefighters and police arrived and began searching the area. They cleared the pool, checking every nearby restroom, hallway, and storage room. Divers went in and searched the bottom of the water. They drained parts of the pool to make it clearer, but there was no sign of Aaliyah anywhere. Then, one of the maintenance workers noticed something off. The water in one section of the lazy river wasn't moving right. Normally, the current was smooth and even, but near one wall, it was swirling and pulling harder. This would lead them to shut off the pumps. And when the surface went still, they saw a dark opening, like a circular pipe inlet, about a foot wide along the side wall. Now that opening wasn't supposed to be exposed. It should have had a safety grate covering it. Since this was really weird, investigators used cameras on poles to look inside. The footage showed something caught deep in the pipe, more than like 15 feet down. Before that, one of the firefighters had checked the filtration gauges and noticed the pressure was abnormally high, even though the pumps were off. This was a clear sign something large was blocking the line. When they fed the camera in, they saw strands of hair twisting in the current, and the suction didn't let up. That's when they knew something or someone was trapped inside. When divers moved closer, they could feel the pull on their equipment. One of the firefighters said later that even with the system shut down, the pressure felt like it was trying to drag them in. That's when they knew what happened. The pipe had become a vacuum, a suction powerful enough to trap anyone who got close. It really doesn't take much. Once a person's skin, hair, or even clothing seals over the opening, the pressure can hold them in place with hundreds of pounds of force. And this is what happened to Aaliyah. They worked through the night to reach her, and engineers cut through concrete in sections of the pool wall, draining more water as they went. They literally had to dig down to the circulation system itself, which are thick pipes that carried water throughout the lazy river. The water inside those lines was dark, mixed with chemical foam and debris. When they finally reached the section where the camera had shown movement, they found her. Aaliyah was wedged deep in the pipe, pressed tightly by the suction. The negative pressure had drawn her head and upper torso in first, flattening her chest and shoulders against the curve of the pipe. Her hair had been pulled in by the vacuum and twisted around the intake, binding her in place like a rope. The suction had held her there so forcefully that her back bore deep circular bruises and her arms were pinned above her head. Her skin showed clear signs of pressure marks, which were smooth, round patterns that matched the pipe's edges. When rescuers finally cut her free, her body was limp, with chlorinated water in her lips and fingertips were bluish gray. There were small lacerations on her arms and neck from where she had tried to pull away, but the pull of the pipe had been stronger than any human strength, let alone an 8-year-old girl. Even professional divers later said the force could have torn their masks off, which is crazy. Paramedics were waiting at the surface, but everyone already knew. They tried to resuscitate her, but after hours underwater, there was nothing left to save. Investigators later confirmed that part of the pool's plumbing system had malfunctioned. The pipe that trapped her was supposed to push water out, but something had reversed the flow, turning it into a high-powered intake. Without that protective grate, it acted like a giant vacuum, and when Aaliyah swam near it, the suction pulled her in almost immediately. Now, from what I found online is the force could have easily been over 300 pounds. Impossible for even an adult to fight, let alone an 8-year-old girl like I said before. The cause of death was ruled as drowning and mechanical asphyxiation. She was held underwater by suction until she couldn't breathe. Her airway had filled with water and pressure across her chest prevented her lungs from expanding. By morning, police tapes surrounded the pool. News crews showed up outside the hotel gates. Parents kept their children close while guests watched firefighters and investigators work. The pool looked perfectly normal, but no one went near it. City inspectors arrived that same day. They went through every pipe, valve, and pump in the system, and what they found didn't match the official building plans. Some sections of the plumbing had been changed or added without approval. The pipe that killed her shouldn't have been opened at all, and it wasn't listed on the original blueprints. The grate that should have been covering it was for some reason missing. Officials ordered the pool to be shut down immediately. A few days later, the Houston Health Department cited the hotel for multiple violations, including missing safety equipment and incomplete inspection records. Aaliyah's family filed a lawsuit against the hotel's ownership group and Hilton's corporate branch. Their attorney said what most people already believed, that the accident was entirely preventable. A working grate and proper maintenance would have stopped it all from ever happening. The hotel issued a short statement expressing sympathy, and they said they were cooperating with investigators. But for the family, that wasn't enough. They wanted to know how an 8-year-old girl could vanish in a pool full of people, and how no one noticed for hours. Experts who reviewed the case explained how fast suction entrapments happen. When a high-powered pump is connected to an open pipe, it creates negative pressure strong enough to hold someone down with the weight of a car. Once the body seals the opening, the only way to break the vacuum is to cut the power or break the pipe. Federal pool safety laws passed after similar cases require all drains and suction lines and anti-entrapment systems. But if a cover is missing or a valve malfunctions, it only takes a few seconds for tragedy. 2 weeks later, her family held a memorial in a park in Houston. Dozens of people came, classmates, teachers, and friends. Balloons shaped like butterflies were released into the sky, as they were Aaliyah's favorite animals, each one carrying a handwritten note. Since the accident, the pool has remained closed. Engineers later sealed off the old pipe system and rebuilt the entire circulation layout with multiple safety covers and alarms. The lazy river hasn't reopened. It sits empty, drained, and silent. As for the lawsuit, I wasn't able to find any public record that the lawsuit by the family of Aaliyah has been resolved yet. They are seeking more than $1 million in damages, with some reports citing a much larger figure for alleged negligence that contributed to Aaliyah's death. The hotel owner's response includes allegations that the mother's actions were partially responsible, and they are contesting liability, which is the dumbest shit I've ever heard, as I don't know what the mother could have done better in that situation. Harvest season in West Texas doesn't really stop when the sun goes down. The work just shifts under floodlights. The air gets colder and the sky goes black, with the sound of diesel engines becoming the only thing that fills the fields. That's how it was that Wednesday night, November 15th, 2017, out near Palmer County. The Dyke family had been running cotton all day. Out there, kids grew up around machines the size of small houses, and by the time they're teenagers, they know how to handle them well. 15-year-old Nicholas Dyke was one of those kids. He wasn't reckless, and everyone said he worked hard and followed directions. But when you're raised in that kind of world, you stop thinking of those machines as dangerous. More of they're just part of the job. The family was wrapping up the day's harvest. The big green pickers had finished their passes, leaving lines of clean white modules, each one a packed wall of cotton waiting to be hauled off. Floodlights on the tractors lit the roads like a stadium. The dust hung in the air, sticking to skin and sweat. Nicholas stayed out late with one of the operators to finish a module. They were using a cotton module builder, which is basically a giant metal box with a hydraulic ram that compacts the loose cotton into a dense block. To simplify it, cotton goes in, the press comes down, and the load gets packed tight enough to hold shape on its own. Now you don't need to get near the inside when it's running. Everyone knows that, at least the people familiar with this kind of work. Now the field was quiet except for the hum of engines and the hiss of hydraulics. Nicholas was working the back end, leveling the cotton with a rake between cycles. The operator was up in the tractor cab controlling the press. Now they had done this hundreds of times. Press down, lift, add more cotton, repeat. So it was quite easy, but unfortunately no one saw what happened next. It's possible Nicholas stepped in to fix an uneven spot, or even maybe some of the cotton bunched up and he leaned closer to spread it out, but we don't actually know. But what is certain is that he was inside the danger zone when the hydraulic ram came down again. See, the module builder doesn't really care what's inside it. The ram always moves with full force, dropping several tons of pressure in a single motion, so it pressed down through the loose cotton and onto Nicholas before he could even move. The sound it made, the slow hydraulic groan, covered everything else, even his screams. He would have been trapped right when it happened. The cotton packed tight around his body, sealing him inside. The pressure crushed his ribs and chest, forcing the air from his lungs before he could even shout. As the cotton compressed, it filled his mouth and nose, so breathing became impossible in seconds. He was essentially buried alive under thousands of material. Up in the tractor cab, the operator didn't notice at first. He finished the cycle, lifted the ram, and waited for the next load to go in, but when he looked down, he didn't see Nicholas. He figured the boy might have stepped off to grab something from the truck, so he called out, but got no response. The others came over, curious, shining their flashlights through the dust. They checked behind the machines, down the rows, and near the vehicles, but nothing. Then one of them spotted the handle of a rake sticking out from the edge of the half-finished module, and that's when everything stopped. They killed the engines and called 911. The field went silent except for the wind. Deputies and paramedics from Palmer County arrived around 10 that night. The floodlights from the pickers were still on, casting long shadows across the cotton rows. The rescuers climbed onto the module, digging through the compacted cotton by hand. It wasn't like soil. It was dense, heavy, and almost solid. They used shovels and cutters to break through the outer layer, and the heat inside the block was noticeable. Cotton holds warmth, and the pressure of the machine had made it even worse. When they finally reached him, he was buried deep in the mass, his upper body pinned where the ram had come down. His clothing was torn, skin covered in lint and dirt. The pressure had crushed his chest inward, and the cotton around him was soaked with blood from internal injuries. His fingers were curled tight, still holding onto a clump of fiber. There wasn't anything the paramedics could even do. He had been trapped for just too long. The deputies stood by while the crew worked to free him, cutting away the bent steel panels of the module builder to reach the last section. When they lifted him out, the engines nearby ticked quietly as they cooled, and nobody said a word. The sheriff's report later called it a farming accident, one of those things that happen when routine meets machinery. The module builder was inspected that night, and there was no mechanical fault. Everything worked like it was supposed to. The safety protocols just didn't matter once he stepped inside the chamber, and the press cycle was automatic once engaged, so there was no way to stop it mid-stroke. Investigators took photos, measured distances, and logged the timeline. The cotton module stood half-finished, its top layer dented where the press had come down. A cut through the side panel showed where they had pulled him out. The rake he had been using lay nearby, bent at the handle. The next morning, the field was empty again. The machines were parked in a row, the dirt still rutted with the tire tracks. The module he had been working on remained standing, a solid wall of cotton with a missing section torn out. To anyone passing by, it looked like part of a normal harvest. Only the people who had been there knew who was inside the night before. Nicholas's death was ruled accidental, and there was no sign of malfunction or negligence. He had really just been in the wrong place at the wrong moment. A week later, the module was hauled away for inspection, where the crew said the field still smelled like machine oil and dust. They finished the season quietly. Crocodile farming operations are common around Siem Reap in northwestern Cambodia. Families maintain large concrete pits behind their homes, in which dozens of crocodiles live in shallow, murky waters. These animals are raised primarily for their hides and meat, both of which fetch value locally and internationally. It's a lot more than you actually think. The enclosures are surrounded by high cement walls and heavy gates designed to separate people from the animals, and most of the time these barriers work. Now, the crocodiles often lie still beneath the surface of the water, appearing harmless. But the danger is real because only a single misstep is needed for a disaster. Behind one of the family's homes on the outskirts of Siem Reap, several of these enclosures sat in a row. A father managed them daily, so he was familiar with the feeding schedule, the gate mechanisms, and the low sound the crocodiles made when moving through the water. Now, these pits formed a big part of his livelihood and his family's routine. Inside the house, his wife cooked and cared for their 2-year-old daughter, Ram Rath Neri. The child often played near the back door, watching her father from a distance, but not going beyond the yard for obvious reasons. Now, one morning in June 2019 followed the same pattern as usual. The father was checking on the crocodile pits, and the mother was inside working on household chores. Now, the back door to the yard was open, letting in heat and light, but this was a horrible mistake, because at some point, their daughter slipped away unnoticed. The low hum of the machinery from nearby farms and the calls of birds filled the air, and no one noticed her leave the house. Now, behind the house, one section of the crocodile pit was covered only partially by a thin wooden plank. It was a temporary walkway used by the father to move along the edge of the enclosure, so it was not fixed in place and could not reliably support much weight. I want you to keep that in mind. Now, for whatever reason, probably curiosity, the little girl made her way toward that plank. She likely looked down into the water where the surface reflected the daylight and appeared calm and green. Then she stepped too far. The splash was loud enough for the father outside to hear almost immediately. He turned, and from where he was standing, he could see that something small and light-colored had fallen into that pit. And in that instant, he realized his daughter wasn't in sight, so he started running toward it. When he reached the edge of the enclosure, the water below was already erupting. The crocodiles that had been resting near the bottom surged upward, drawn by the vibration of the splash. The surface broke apart violently. Dozens of open jaws snapped shut on contact. The sound of flesh and bone colliding echoed off the solid concrete walls, and the forces of the bites tore through skin and muscle in an instant. The father screamed and grabbed anything nearby to fight them off. He hurled sticks and buckets into the pit, hoping to drive the crocodiles away, but the water had already turned red. The crocodiles were spinning, twisting with their prey in their jaws, executing what is called the death roll. Now, I'm not going to explain what that is because I'm pretty sure everyone already knows what that is. Neighbors heard the shouting and hurried to the yard, and what they witnessed was a scene of chaos. A crocodile pit thrashing violently, bodies colliding, tails hitting the wall, jaws emerging and submerging, pieces of clothing and a small hand breaking the surface before vanishing under the water. Some neighbors tried to intervene as well. They used long sticks to strike at the crocodiles but found it ineffective. The reptiles just rolled over each other in a frenzy. Their bodies collided as they bit and tore, the blood-slick water churning with foam and red. The air smelled of stagnant water and raw flesh, and when the motion finally stopped, the surface of the water was deeply stained red. Only a few scraps of clothing and some hair floated to one side. The crocodiles drifted motionless again, the yellow eyes just above the water surface. When the father reached down and retrieved what was remained of his daughter, the body had been mutilated beyond recognition. Her skull was crushed on one side, both arms severed, and her torso was torn open. He carried the remains out of the pit with his arms covered in blood. Witnesses say he was trembling and screaming, holding her shredded body wrapped in a thin cloth. Police and emergency workers arrived shortly afterwards, and when they entered, the scene was quiet except for the faint movement of crocodiles through the murky water. The father sat near the edge of the pit, soaked in blood, staring into the distance. Officers had to gently pull him away so they could proceed. The smell of blood and heat filled the air, with one officer describing seeing clumps of the girl's hair and torn fabric caught on the concrete lip of the enclosure. The medical report that followed documented the full extent of the trauma: crushing injuries to the skull and chest, deep tearing wounds consistent with multiple biting and underwater rotation. Investigators concluded that the death had occurred within seconds of the fall into the water. Measuring the enclosure, police found the wall to be about 3 feet high, insufficient to prevent a small child from climbing or falling over the edge. The wooden plank at the edge was splintered, its surface slick with water. Although the back door from the house to the yard had been opened that morning, allowing the child to step outside. The mother was taken inside the home and treated for shock. Neighbors remained close, silent, and shaken. The investigation wound down, and by the evening the family had begun funeral preparations. The child's body was placed into a small white coffin, wrapped in a red and white cloth. Monks performed the traditional blessings. The authorities ruled the incident as an accident, so no criminal charges were brought. Officials released a statement reminding all crocodile farmers in the region to reinforce their barriers, keep gates locked, and remove unsecured boards or walkways from the enclosures. They emphasized that children must be kept well away from crocodile pits at all times. In early 2023, at the 3M manufacturing plant in Wisconsin, a longtime employee named Trisha Jones went to work as she always did. Now, the 3M facility is one of the largest employers in the area, producing industrial materials like adhesives, filters, and films. It's a massive complex, so a series of long metal buildings filled with machinery that runs almost non-stop. Now, inside the environment, it's hot and loud. The air kinda smells like oil and chemical solvents. Conveyor belts and rollers moved in constant rhythm, and heavy presses pound through layers of material. Each machine is built for precision, but operates with immense power, so enough to flatten, shear, or crush anything that gets caught in its path. Workers in that environment live by strict procedures. The most important one is called lockout/tagout. It's meant to make sure a machine is fully powered down and secured before anyone touches or inspects it. Every employee is trained on it. It's the rule that separates maintenance from disaster. Now, Trisha Jones had been working at 3M for years, so she knew the routines, the equipment, and the safety rules. Her job that morning involved monitoring and maintaining part of a roller line, a machine that presses large sheets of adhesive material through 2 massive steel cylinders. Each roller weighs hundreds of pounds and spins fast enough to crush bone or even steel tools if caught in the gap. Now, the day started off quite normal. Trisha arrived for her shift, put on her gloves, and checked in the machines in her section. For hours, everything ran smoothly. Then sometime before noon, one of the roller systems began to slow, possibly from a small jam or even a misfeed. It wasn't unusual. Most of the time a quick check or a minor adjustment could fix it. Now, Trisha approached the roller assembly to take a look, but the machine hadn't been completely powered down, so the rollers were still turning, although slow but still active. She leaned forward to see what was wrong, maybe to pull a piece of the material free or adjust something near the feed point. And that's when it happened. They think her jacket sleeve brushed against the edge of the moving roller, and this contact was instant. The spinning steel grabbed the fabric and wound it tight in less than a second. Before she could even react, it yanked her arm forward with tremendous force. The sound that followed was muffled beneath the roar of the other machines. A dull, heavy thud mixed with a high-pitched whine of friction. Her body slammed against the front of the machine as the roller continued to pull. Her shoulders dislocated instantly, and the skin on her arm tore as the fabric and flesh twisted together. She screamed and tried to brace herself against the housing, but the machine just didn't stop. The roller dragged her in further, crushing her arm up to the shoulder, then pulling her torso tight against the cylinders. The pressure forced blood and tissue out around the contact point. Her chest compressed under the mechanical weight, with her ribs snapping one after another. Her head hit the steel frame hard enough to fracture her skull. Nearby workers turned at the sound of the scream, and what they saw stopped them cold. Trisha's upper body was half inside the machine, her legs kicking weakly against the floor as the roller spun. The sleeve of her jacket had disappeared completely into the gap, and the blood was already pooling beneath the frame. Supervisors shouted for the emergency shutoff. The alarm went off with a shrill metallic tone that echoed through the building. But the machine didn't stop right away. See, the rollers were massive and took several seconds to slow down, even after the power was cut. And during that time, the motion continued grinding forward, forcing her body deeper into the mechanism. When the rotation finally stopped, she wasn't moving. Her upper torso was pinned tightly between the rollers, with her face pressed against the steel. Her clothing had shredded and parts of her skin and hair were entangled in the gears. One of her shoes had come off and was lying several feet away, soaked in blood. Coworkers rushed toward her, trying to pull her free, but her body was wedged in place. The machine was slick with oil and blood, and the smell of hot metal and burnt fabric filled the air. Someone shouted her name, but there was no response. Her body at this point had gone limp. Emergency crews would arrive within minutes. When paramedics and firefighters reached her, they could see that most of her upper body was crushed beyond any recognition. The rollers had completely flattened her chest and abdomen, splitting open her ribcage. Her arm was completely mangled, with her bones shattered and twisting around the rotating shaft. The pressure had forced blood and tissue into the gears, leaving dark streaks across the machine's surface. Firefighters used hydraulic spreaders and cutting tools to dismantle part of the rolling housing. The process was slow and tense. Every moment risked making the injuries worse or even damaging evidence for the investigation. So it took them nearly 30 minutes to finally free her completely. When paramedics finally pulled her out, she was pale, soaked in oil and blood, and also lifeless. Her torso had collapsed from the crushing force, and parts of her shoulder and back were torn open. Her face showed massive trauma, fractures from the skull and jaw from where she had been struck from the steel frame. The medical team checked for a pulse, but found nothing, so she was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later documented the injuries as massive blunt force trauma and mechanical asphyxiation. The crushing pressure on her chest had destroyed her lungs and her heart almost instantly, and based off the extent of the injuries, she likely lost consciousness within seconds of being pulled in. Now, OSHA launched an immediate investigation. Inspectors arrived that afternoon, photographing the scene, reviewing maintenance logs, and interviewing witnesses. Their findings, like most cases, were straightforward. The accident was preventable. The machine had not been properly locked out before Trisha approached it, so it was still running, and there was no physical barrier or sensor to stop it when she leaned too close. OSHA cited 3M for multiple violations, including failure to follow lockout/tackle procedures and insufficient protection against contact with moving parts. The fines totaled tens of thousands of dollars. The company issued a statement expressing condolences and promised to reevaluate safety training across all facilities. But for the workers who were there that day, the aftermath was traumatic. Several had to be sent home after the cleanup began. Blood had splattered across the floor and nearby walls, and the roller assembly was so badly contaminated that it had to be partially replaced. Now, there's no record of a lawsuit filed by Trisha Jones' family against 3M. Under Wisconsin workers' compensation law, families cannot directly sue their employer after a workplace death unless they can prove intentional disregard for safety, which technically OSHA did not find her. To explain it a bit more, because there was no clear proof that 3M knew about the exact hazard and chose to ignore it, they couldn't sue. They saw it as a tragic procedural breakdown, preventable yes, but not deliberate. That means her family likely received workers' compensation death benefits, which typically include funeral costs and partial wage payments to dependents. 3M cooperated fully with investigators, accepted OSHA citations, and paid the administrative fines, which were estimated to be between $25,000 and $65,000, depending on the final classifications of the violations. No criminal charges were filed, and OSHA's report concluded the machine was functioning correctly. Unfortunately, like most cases, the lockout system was not being used when it should have been. Work inside an elevator shaft is some of the most dangerous work in construction. It involves confined spaces, open vertical drops, and heavy machinery. Every level of a building is connected by that single column of empty air. One misstep can mean falling hundreds of feet before hitting concrete. Now, at a Midtown Manhattan construction site in May 2015, everyone knew that danger. The future Ryu Plaza Times Square Hotel was still just a skeleton of steel and concrete. Workers moved through the building in hard hats, guiding beams into place and welding frames. The floors were unfinished and the edges were lined with temporary guardrails, and in the center, several open elevator shafts ran straight from the basement to the roof. Inside one of those shafts, crews were installing elevator systems that would eventually carry guests through the new high-rise. The shafts were narrow and dimly lit, with the walls being unfinished and coated in dust. Work lights hung low from cords, swinging slightly as the air moved through the building. The smell of concrete dust and welding smoke filled the space. Now, among that crew that day was Christian Ganisi. He worked for a subcontractor hired to install the elevators. His duties included helping fit door frames and guard rails, so the metal channels that keep the elevator cars moving straight up and down the shaft. The job required precision and physical effort. It also required trust. Workers inside the shaft relied on each other and on the machinery to keep them safe. Christian and another worker were using one of the construction elevators, a temporary car built for installation work. Now keep in mind, it wasn't finished. Just a platform with partial walls and a simple control panel. It was designed to move workers and tools between floors while the main systems were still being assembled. Now, around 12:40 p.m., the elevator they were in stopped unexpectedly between the 23rd and the 24th floors. It hadn't reached the landing. The car was about 5 feet below the 24th opening, hanging still, so the two men waited, expecting it to move again, but it didn't. The motor had stalled. Normally, when an elevator stops short, workers are supposed to stay inside until it can be reset or stabilized by maintenance personnel. But it was midday, the site was busy, and the gap didn't really look large, so they decided to get out on their own. The other worker went first. He climbed into the lip of the car, grabbed the floor edge above, and pulled himself up. The landing's edge was made of bare concrete and rebar, coated in construction dust. He managed to get both feet over and stood up on the floor safely. Because the other worker made it, Christian would follow. He stepped onto the edge of the elevator car, crouched slightly, and pushed off to grab the landing above. Now, this is where everything went wrong. His boot slipped on the metal surface as he jumped, because it was coated with dust and a thin film of oil from the machinery. This would lead to his hand missing the ledge by inches. Now, there was no time to recover. He lost balance and fell backward into the open elevator shaft. Workers above heard the sound immediately, and then a long hollow noise, the scrape of his boot against the edge, a short yell, and then a long hollow noise as his body fell through the open vertical tunnel. Now, that drop from that height was more than 200 feet. And to make this all even worse, inside the shaft were cross beams, support rails, and brackets for the elevator doors. So as he fell, his body struck the sides of the shaft multiple times, hitting the metal guardrails and protruding bolts, stripped away pieces of his clothing, and left blood along the concrete wall. The noise echoed upward, so sharp metal strikes followed by dull thuds as his body hit successive levels. The fall finally ended in the basement level, where the unfinished shaft met the concrete foundation of the building, and this impact was catastrophic. Workers on the lower floors felt the vibration through the floor. When they looked toward the shaft opening, they saw dust rising from below, and when that happened, someone shouted for everyone to stop working. All the power tools on that site went silent across the site. Crews on the ground level ran toward the basement. The shaft opening was surrounded by scaffolding and loose materials, and when they looked down, they saw him lying face up on the concrete, motionless. His helmet had shattered on impact. Pieces of it were scattered around him, along with fragments of broken light fixtures and steel brackets knocked loose during the fall. The damage to his body was obviously severe. The impact had crushed his skull and spine, and multiple bones were broken. His right leg was twisted unnaturally beneath him, and there were visible fractures along both arms. Blood had pooled beneath his torso and splattered along the nearby wall. The fall had torn his clothing apart, leaving deep abrasions where metal rails had sliced through fabric and skin on the way down. Workers stood at the edge of the opening, stunned. Someone climbed down partway on a ladder, calling his name, but he didn't move. They could also see that his chest wasn't rising. When this happened, calls went out to 911 in the building's front office. The sound of sirens reached the site minutes later. Firefighters and paramedics would arrive, carrying harnesses and stretchers. They secured the area and descended carefully into the shaft, aware that debris could still fall from above. The paramedics reached him first. His body was cold and still. They checked for a pulse and found none. His injuries seemed instant and fatal. Massive blunt force trauma to the head, neck, and torso. His ribs had collapsed inward from the impact, and internal bleeding was visible even through the torn fabric. Firefighters used ropes and a stretcher to lift his body back up to the shaft. It was a slow process, because they had to navigate around the same beams and brackets he had struck on the way down. Dust fell as they moved, coating their helmets and gloves. The shaft smelled of concrete, dust, and blood. When his body finally reached the basement level, they laid him on the floor and covered him with a white sheet. His boots were missing. One had actually came off during the fall and was found several floors above. The police arrived shortly after, setting up a perimeter and beginning photographs on the scene. They measured the distance between the elevator car and the landing above it. It was a 5-foot gap that it seemed small enough to step across. Investigators marked the shaft walls where blood and fabric had stuck to the concrete, showing the path of his fall. From the 24th floor to the basement, each mark traced another violent impact. By the time the recovery team carried his body out through the ground level entrance, the workday had effectively ended. The sun was starting to lower behind the nearby buildings, throwing long shadows across the site. It was found out he had fallen less than 3 seconds before hitting the ground, a drop long enough for a single scream and thin silence. It was only a short distance to jump, just a few feet to the next floor, but with no guardrail, no tether, and no margin for error, it was enough. Christian was just 25 years old. He had been doing a routine task he had done dozens of times before, and one slip turned it into a fatal fall that no one could stop. In the days after the accident, OSHA and the New York City Department of Buildings opened a joint investigation. Inspectors documented that the elevator subcontractor, G Tech Associates, had been operating without a valid city license. They found that the guardrails were missing around the shaft's openings, and that no fall protection was in use. The Department of Buildings issued a stop work order and cited the contractor for a Class 1 aggravated safety violation, which is the most serious classification. OSHA investigators later determined that the accident was entirely preventable, the result of improper safety procedures and a lack of fall protection. The body was released to his family after the medical examiner's review. His funeral was held a few days later in New Jersey, near his hometown. Because of the nature of his injuries, the service was closed casket. Families, friends, and fellow veterans attended, along with several co-workers from the site. And because Christian was a U.S. Army veteran, the Army provided an honor guard at the burial. His mother received a folded flag at the end of the ceremony. Suzanne Hart, age 41, arrived for work at Young & Rubicam. It's an advertising agency located at 285 Madison Avenue in Manhattan, on the morning of December 14th, 2011. It was just before 10 a.m. and employees were coming in for the day. The building was an older midtown high-rise with multiple elevators servicing the upper floors. That morning, one of those elevators was undergoing routine maintenance. The doors were open and a mechanic from Transel Elevator Inc. TEI Group was in the elevator bank area performing electrical adjustments on the control system from a nearby service panel. The elevator car had been taken out of service, but the safety lock that should have kept it immobilized had not been properly engaged. Now, Suzanne entered the lobby as usual, holding a coffee cup and her phone. She worked as an account executive and took the elevator daily to reach her floor. Security footage showed her walking toward the bank of elevators, where 2 employees were waiting. One elevator stood open on the first floor, its doors wide and lights on the inside. To anyone passing by it, it appeared to be functioning normally, but what no one realized was that the elevator was not properly secured. See, the car was parked a few inches higher than the landing, and maintenance wires were still connected. The door interlock circuit had been temporarily bypassed for testing, leaving the control system live. Inside the bank, a mechanic was adjusting wiring on the electrical panel, not realizing that the energized circuit would allow the car to move. So, at 9:56 a.m., Suzanne stepped forward into the open elevator. As soon as she crossed the threshold, the car suddenly rose upward. See, the doors had not yet fully closed, but because the bypass left the circuit active, the elevator motor engaged the instant her weight triggered the floor sensor. After that, the elevator surged upward with her halfway inside, so in less than a second she was trapped at the chest level against the top of the doorway. The rising car pulled her upper body into the shaft while her legs and feet remained in the lobby. so her head and shoulders were forced into the shaft space, and the moving car trapped her between the floor of the elevator and the frame of the first floor entrance. The lower portion of her body was pinned outside, leaving her legs visible in the lobby. Witnesses nearby heard a sharp mechanical noise followed by screams. One of the two employees waiting behind her jumped back as the door slammed shut around Suzanne's midsection. Another worker pressed the emergency stop and ran for help. The noise echoed through the marble lobby, the grinding of a metal on metal followed by silence. Security staff immediately called 911. Firefighters and paramedics would arrive within minutes. They found Suzanne's body wedged in the doorway. The elevator stopped several feet above the lobby ceiling. Her injuries were instantly fatal. Massive crushing trauma to the chest, abdomen, and spine. Pressure had compressed her body against the frame, causing irreversible internal damage. Firefighters worked carefully to stabilize the car before attempting to free her. Before they could lower it though, every shaft in the bank had to be secured and power isolated to prevent secondary movement. That process alone took a whole hour. Using manual lowering gear, crews then brought the car down a few inches at a time until they could reach her safely. In total, it took almost 2 hours to recover her remains. When the car was lowered, it revealed that her upper body had been drawn entirely into the shaft, while her legs and feet were still outside, like I said. The New York City Department of Buildings DOB and OSHA opened an investigation. Inspectors determined that the maintenance crew had bypassed key safety mechanisms, including a jumper wire used to override the door interlock circuit, and this allowed the elevator to move even though the doors were open, something that should have been mechanically impossible. Transcell Elevator Inc. was cited for multiple violations. City records show that the mechanical performing maintenance that morning had temporarily overridden the door safety circuit to test the car's function. He was supposed to remove the jumper wire before returning power, but failed to do so. So when Suzanne stepped inside, the elevator system interpreted it as a normal call and engaged the motor. DOB investigators confirmed that the lift moved upward at full speed at the exact moment she entered. The automatic door system had been effectively tricked into thinking the doors were shut. There was no time for her or anyone nearby to react, as the entire event lasted less than even 2 seconds. The autopsy later confirmed the cause of death as crushing injuries to the torso, so death was instantaneous. City officials ordered all 13 elevators in the building shut down immediately for safety testing. Workers who had been in the lobby described the aftermath as eerily quiet, her coffee cup lying on the marble floor, and her cell phone vibrating nearby. OSHA's investigation concluded months later, citing Transcell Elevator Inc. for quote willful safety violations related to improper maintenance practices. The company was ultimately fined $14,000, the maximum penalty at the time, for a single willful violation, for failing to ensure that the elevator's interlock systems were properly disabled before restoring power. The New York City Department of Buildings also issued 23 separate violations to Transcell and the building's management, including, quote, failure to maintain elevator equipment, unsafe maintenance procedures, and inadequate supervision during testing. The city's final report stated that 3 mechanics had been working on the elevators that morning, and that one improperly left a jumper wire in place, directly leading to the fatal movement of the car. As a result, the DOB suspended Transcell's license for 30 days and required all mechanics involved to undergo retraining and recertification before returning to work. The building reopened its elevators only after full inspections and rewiring of all safety interlocks. Suzanne's funeral was held in New York City several days later. It was a private service attended by family, friends, and co-workers from Young and Rupa Kam. The casket was closed. Mourners described her as intelligent, warm, and deeply dedicated to her work. She was also known in the office for arriving early every morning, always with a coffee in hand, smiling and ready to start the day.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.